Today's podcast features 3 classic scary stories. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Turn Around, and it's about why you should never explore abandoned buildings. The second story you'll hear is called The Witch, and it's about a firefighter who finds a very strange-looking cabin out in the woods. And the third and final story you'll hear is called The Woman in Black. And it's up to you if you believe this is really sleep paralysis or a paranormal haunting. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to spot the Amazon Music follow button on their next set of bench press, but once they start to fatigue, just walk away. Okay, let's get into our first story called Turn Around. From the 1950s until present, a Canadian family has owned this very isolated cabin in the middle of the Ontario backcountry. It was the only property on this very small lake. There was 2 others across the lake, but they were pretty far away. And with the exception of the side of the cabin that was facing the water, the rest of it was surrounded by really dense forest that went on for quite a while. About 2 miles away from this cabin, on the other side of this dirt road, was this huge wildlife reserve that was pretty much just a huge forest that was protected. And anytime the family was visiting this cabin, the kids would at some point go into the reserve and go explore. In 2001, when the family was at the cabin, the kids were across the road over at the reserve, and they decided to walk down this particular trail that they hadn't seen before, and they just started walking. And for about 30 minutes, they're seeing new areas they hadn't seen before, and then they come to this clearing, and there's all these abandoned houses. At first, there was a little debate about whether these were actually abandoned because they did look like they were in pretty good condition. But when they walked a little bit closer, it became very clear that nature is reclaiming this land. Grass is up to your waist. There's vines growing up the side of the houses. There were cars still parked in driveways that were totally rusted out, and, grass is growing all through them. And so they knew these were abandoned. They walked up to the first house they saw, and they looked in, and they couldn't believe what they were looking at. It was like whoever lived here had left without taking anything. The house was still totally furnished. In fact, their dining room tables still had plates and cups and forks and knives, like they had just had dinner and then just got up and left. They start talking about going into these houses and looking around inside, but they started wondering, is this a museum? Is that why everything is in such good repair? Should we not go inside these houses? And they start looking around for any indication that definitely this is not a museum, these are just plain abandoned. And across the street from the house they were at was this totally decrepit looking house. Let's go over there and look in there. And so they look in a window, and very clearly the ceiling is totally sagging down. And the first floor is buckling completely, and there's clothes and shoes scattered everywhere. And so for them, this was confirmation that this is no museum. These are abandoned. We can totally go look around inside. And so for the next couple of hours, the kids explored all the houses that looked structurally sound, that weren't going to collapse on them. And it was just fascinating. There was all this stuff that was left behind that was fairly valuable. And they didn't take anything. They just thought it was very cool. And after a while, they decided they had seen enough, and they turned around and headed back to their cabin. After they got back, they told their parents about what they found, and their father was like, "Man, that sounds awesome. I want to go check that out." And so that day, they went right back over to the abandoned houses. The first house they showed him was the really decrepit looking one where the ceiling was sagging and there was women's shoes and clothes all over the ground, to show him for sure these are abandoned, because we had some doubts at first too. These were definitely abandoned. So they look at that house, and then they went back to the very first house they saw when they walked into this complex, the one that was in great condition and had the dining table still set. So they go inside and they go upstairs and they find this bedroom that, like everything else in the house, is totally intact. You got pictures on the wall, it's fully furnished. There's even still sheets made on the bed, in the pillow. It's got a head imprint from whoever was there last. And at the foot of the bed is this beautiful fur coat. And the father walks over to it and he looks at it and he's like, "This is real fur. This is a really expensive coat. I want to take this for our family." But before he took it, he had a hesitation. Is this really abandoned? if someone had been here, they would have seen footprints all over the house just because there's grime all over the ground, and they can clearly see their footprints from where they've just come in. And he's like, no, this is just a weird situation. It's definitely abandoned, and finders keepers. And so he picks up the jacket and he says, I'm going to give this to Mom after I clean it up. And so with the jacket in hand, the father and the kids explore the rest of the house. And when they go outside, they realize it's starting to get late and it's probably time to head back. And so they turn around and they start walking away from these houses towards their cabin. And they get about 50 or 60 meters away when one of the kids said he just had this weird sense that they were being watched. And so he turns around and he's shocked when he sees there is an old woman standing in the bedroom that they had just been in, where the fur coat was. She's got a loose bun on the top of her head. She's got this blue shawl on her shoulders over a cream blouse, and she's glaring at them. When the father saw this woman, he made an audible gasp, and the rest of the group turned around too and saw this woman in the window. And the feeling was guilt. They're like, oh my goodness, we just stole from this poor woman who lives in this abandoned house. And so right away, the whole group starts walking right back towards the house. They're going to give this jacket back. In fact, the dad is like, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have taken this. I'm sorry. And as they're walking back towards the property, the woman in the window who hasn't said anything just turns around and walks back into the main part of the house. They can't see her anymore. And so as they're walking closer to the house, they're assuming she's going to come downstairs to retrieve this jacket that they've taken from her. And so they get right up to the front door, and the father is yelling to her, I'm sorry, where do you want me to leave this jacket? I can bring it into you. And they're kind of just waiting for her to come downstairs, and she doesn't. She's nowhere to be found. She's not making any sound. She's not indicating what to do. And so after waiting for a couple of minutes, the kids don't really know what to do, and they're kind of getting uneasy about the situation. And the father's still very confident that he just wants to give this back and make amends, make peace with her, say he's sorry. And so he walks inside. He tells his kids, stay here, I'm going to go give it to her. And he goes inside and he disappears upstairs. And then all of a sudden, from across the street in that decrepit house with the caved-in ceiling, they hear one of the second floor windows come slamming down. And at the same time, their dad comes charging down the stairs, no jacket with him, and he's saying, go, go, go. And the kids are spooked from the window getting slammed, and they start running away until they're about 100 meters away from these houses. And they stop, and they're panting, and they're out of breath. And the kids ask their dad, what happened? And he says to them, I looked everywhere upstairs and I could not find that lady. I don't know where she is. Either she's hiding from us or something, but I happened to be looking out at that other house. Something caught my eye. There was movement, and I saw another person in the second floor of that building that's falling apart. And I watched them slam the window. And then as soon as I did, I heard someone yell, get out. And I ran out after you guys. Now, the kids and the dad are absolutely terrified and they want to leave, but they also want one more look at these buildings before they do. And when they had run away, they had stopped behind this big group of trees that obscured their view to the buildings. They were out of sight. And so they begin to peek their heads around the tree until they can see the building, and they can't believe what they see. Standing in the window of the fur coat room is not only the old woman, but also a very tall man who's holding her shoulders and is bending down because his head is too high to look standing. He's crouched down and he's looking out the window next to her, and they're both glaring towards them. The father and his kids are practically falling over themselves to sprint away and back to their cabin. To this day, that family has no idea who those people were, what they were doing there, how they were able to move around without making any noise and consistently hide from them and not leave any footprints. It was all very strange and terrifying stuff. And then the government ended up demolishing those houses almost immediately after they were there. And so they'll never get any answers because everything's gone.
Our next story is called The Witch.
In 2004, wildland firefighters were called into a forest in central Idaho to combat an emerging fire. By the time the crew arrived at this forest, it was clear this fire was spreading a lot faster than they anticipated. As a result, Mike, who was the assistant superintendent, basically the second in command of this particular crew, he said he was going to hop on the ATV and drive off way ahead of them to see if they needed to spread out farther to stop this fire. So Mike hops on an ATV and he takes off down this ancient looking logging road that probably hasn't seen a vehicle or a person in decades. Mike had made it about a half mile down this trail when he noticed out of the corner of his eye a bobcat was running perpendicular to him straight out of the forest as if it was going to cross the road about 100 feet in front of him. Mike comes to a stop and thinks this bobcat doesn't know I'm here. It probably is not used to seeing people. It's going to come out into this trail, see me, get spooked, and run away. But instead, this bobcat runs directly into the middle of the road, turns, and faces Mike in a very aggressive posture. Mike is shocked at what he's seeing because he knows bobcats are notoriously elusive and they're nocturnal. So for this thing to be out in the daytime and to be intentionally blocking his path and standing there aggressively like it's going to attack him was so out of the ordinary. So the two of them are just looking at each other, not moving for about 10 seconds until this bobcat opens its mouth and then begins screaming like a person. It did not seem like the right sound for what he was looking at. He said more than scary, it was just intensely weird. And just as quickly as this bobcat has arrived, it stops screaming, turns and runs to a tree, sprints up the tree and climbs onto this branch that happens to be perched right over the trail he's on. And Mike's looking up at this bobcat that's right over this trail, and he knows if I'm going to continue going down this trail, I have to go under this screaming bobcat. Although totally freaked out, he knew he needed to keep going down this trail, and he's thinking to himself, you know what, this bobcat is probably just scared of me, and that was its reaction, as bizarre as it was. And so he throws his ATV in gear and he starts slowly moving down the trail, the whole time keeping his eye on the bobcat, making sure it doesn't show any sign like it's going to leap off onto him. And as he got closer and closer, he just gunned it and sped underneath the branch, and luckily it didn't jump down on him. And as he got a little bit farther away, he turned up to look, and the bobcat had turned around and was still watching him very intently sitting on this branch. Mike makes it about another half mile down the road before he sees something else that's very strange. He sees a cabin. It's this little tiny cabin that's tucked away in the woods, and he's thinking to himself, I'm on federal land. There aren't supposed to be any private structures here. And he figures, even if this is illegal, I do need to stop and make sure no one's in there because there's this huge fire coming this way. And so he parks his ATV and he starts walking off the trail towards this cabin. And as he gets closer, he can tell it's not only a very old cabin, but it's almost certainly abandoned because he can see all these slats that have been put over all of the windows, like it's been boarded up. But when he got up close, he noticed something strange. The door itself into this cabin was not boarded up, and the doorknob was missing. And in its place was this shiny silver chain link that was thread through the opening where there should have been a doorknob around a wooden post that was right outside the door. Basically a makeshift lock because there was no doorknob to it. And he's thinking how weird it is that in the middle of this forest, on an old ancient logging road that clearly no one goes down, where bobcats are running around freely, that there would be this new chain here, which indicates someone must have been here recently. And so he bends down to look through the space that was still there from where the doorknob should have been, and he looks inside, and he can't really see anything. And so he takes his flashlight and he shines it in, and he can't believe what he's looking at. There's all this furniture inside this tiny little cabin in the middle of nowhere, and it's all upside down. And he's just totally creeped out. So he puts his flashlight away and kind of backs up, and he starts walking back towards the road, and he can't help it, but the whole time he's looking over his shoulder back at the cabin, like someone's going to emerge from outside of this cabin. He gets to the road, and by the time he's there, he's running. He jumps on his ATV, he whips it around, and he starts blazing back up the logging road back towards his crew. And when he turns the corner to where that bobcat was, he sees there is now a Native American woman standing in the middle of the path. She's wearing this tattered white nightgown, she's barefoot, and she's standing in the same spot he saw that bobcat. And she's looking at him as if she's expecting him, like she's been tipped off that he's going to be here. And he stops about 100 feet away from her, and now he's officially freaked out. He's still looking over his shoulder towards that cabin because now everything is just totally weird to him. And before he has a chance to do anything, this woman lets out a scream, a blood-curdling scream that is identical to the bobcat's scream. And so Mike is totally unnerved by this. Everything about this day has really gone sideways as this woman is screaming at the top of her lungs, and then suddenly she stops. Mike's still just standing there like, what's going on? And she runs to the same tree the bobcat had climbed earlier, and she climbs up this tree and gets onto the branch where the bobcat was and perches like an animal on the branch looking at Mike. And now, just like the bobcat, Mike is going to have to drive right underneath this woman who is perched over the trail. And so he throws his ATV in gear and he starts driving, and he's staring at this woman, and now her mouth is just open like she's about to scream again. And as soon as he got close, he gunned it and went right underneath her. And he turned around after he got some distance away from her, and she's still on the branch, now turned around facing him as he drives away. He goes back, he tells the crew what he saw, and as much as they all want to go back and see this woman and see this cabin, they know they can't. They got to fight this fire. And so ultimately they do that, and then they leave. A couple of days later, Mike was in a bar in the town right near the forest they had just been in fighting that fire, and Mike had seen the woman in the cabin, and he struck up a conversation with a local. And he said, "Hey, do you know of any buildings that are in that section of the forest?" And the guy kind of laughed, and he was like, the only building I ever heard of out there was apparently some cabin where some crazy lady thought of herself as a witch, and she apparently had a bobcat for a pet. And so we as kids were just told to stay away from there. So besides that, I don't know.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Woman in Black.
In October of 2005, a 21-year-old named Nathan was back home in Elk Grove, California, visiting his mother at her apartment for a couple of days. Her apartment was part of this really safe complex. It was gated. There's lots of lights and cameras. So anything that went bump in the night was just going to be, your noisy neighbors or something. On the last night of Nathan's stay, he was laying in his bed in the guest room, listening to the hum of the street lamp that was outside and the crickets and the passing by of cars when he drifted off to sleep. At about 2 a.m., Nathan woke up, or so he thought. He couldn't move his body, he could only move his eyes, and even though he had never experienced sleep paralysis before, he instinctively understood this is probably that. He noticed the room was completely silent. There was no more crickets, no more hum of the light outside, no more traffic, just total silence. And then he started flashing his eyes around the room because he couldn't move his head or his body, and he started taking stock of the room. The bed he was in was positioned as far away from the door as he could in the back right corner. From where he was laying, if he looked to his right, in that corner was this big armoire, and then moving left from the armoire as he scanned the room, you'd come to the door, which is on the opposite side of where his bed was, and then if he kept scanning left, he would reach the foot of his bed, and just beyond the foot of his bed was a table and a chair. But because he was laying flat, he couldn't really look down and actually see the table and chair. And so with all of his strength, he managed to raise his head just enough that he had a line of sight to that section of his room, the only section he has not looked at yet. And he sees the table and chair, and he sees in the corner is this dark figure that's standing there looking at him. He's completely frozen with fear. His thought is, there's an intruder in the house. How did they get in here? What are they doing in here? And he managed to keep his head up just long enough to get a decent look at this dark figure, and he determined it was most likely a woman with a shawl covering her face. And before his head fell back to the pillow, he saw her suddenly crouch down on the ground out of view. And then Nathan's head fell back, and now he knows there's just some stranger in his room, and he can't lift his head up anymore, and he's looking around with his eyes. He sees the armoire, he sees the door, he can't see that table and chair, and then he hears the sound of someone slithering along the ground out of view, and he can hear her breathing as she's getting closer and closer to the edge of the bed. And he's laying there terrified. He's so scared he can't even make a sound. And he's telling himself this has to be a dream. Wake up, wake up, wake up. And he's laying there, and this woman, she stands up and she leans out over his bed and she looks at him, and her face is pale and her eyes are sunk way back in her head. Then she begins to slowly crawl on top of him, and Nathan's sitting here looking at this woman. He wants to close his eyes, but he can't. Then he just feels his chest being pressed down. He can hear the sounds of the springs compressing all around him as this woman positions herself on his chest. And then he finally manages to let out a scream, and then suddenly he's awake. The woman's gone. And he sits up and he's looking around. There's nobody in his room. The familiar hum of the light and the crickets and the traffic outside, they all return. And his mom comes running in the room and she's like, "Hey, are you okay? I heard screaming in here." He said, "Oh, no, I had a bad dream. I'm fine now. I had a terrible dream, but I'm fine now." And his mom's like, "Okay, all right, you need anything?" And he's like, "Nope." So she comes over, she gives him a hug and a kiss. She goes back to bed, and he would go downstairs, flip on a Disney movie, actually Aladdin, and he would fall asleep with a Disney movie on and with lights on. And there was no more sleep paralysis that night. The next day, Nathan got up and he headed back to his house, and he couldn't shake the experience. He had never had sleep paralysis before, but it was just so much more terrifying than he ever would have imagined. And he's just thinking to himself, I can't believe there are people that put up with this on any sort of regular basis. But, after a couple of days and getting home and not experiencing any sleep paralysis, time went on and he just kind of forgot about it. A few months later, in March of 2006, Nathan is at this big family party in Chico, California, big outdoor barbecue, all of his family's there, and at some point his sister shows up. His sister was not supposed to be attending this party, so it was a great surprise. He hasn't seen her in a while, and he immediately pulls her aside to catch up with her. And so for the first hour of their conversation, they're just chatting about their lives and what they're up to. Towards the end of their conversation, Nathan suddenly felt compelled to share his sleep paralysis experience with his sister. And the reason he wanted to was because he knew that she knew that he was actually a skeptic. And so she would believe him. If he's telling her this is what happened, she would believe that that's what he saw. And so he starts by saying, I had the weirdest experience at Mom's apartment just a couple of months ago. I'm pretty sure it was sleep paralysis. And his sister immediately butts in and she goes, wait a minute. I had sleep paralysis for the first time in my life 2 weeks ago at Mom's apartment. It was horrible. I was in the guest room and then I saw this woman and she was like standing on me. I thought I was going to die. It was horrible. That's exactly what happened to me. I was laying in the guest room and I couldn't move. And then I saw a woman in the corner and she stood on my chest. They proceeded to go over all the details of each of their stories and they discovered that they had had almost the exact same experience. And at the end of it, they wanted to have a rational explanation for how they both could just somehow have their only sleep paralysis experience in the same room in roughly the same timeline and experience the exact same events. They were trying to, come up with a rational explanation for that, but it was just too much of a coincidence. But ultimately, neither of them were really prepared to start discussing what else it could be. So they decided to just kind of laugh it off and say, man, that's pretty weird, and they moved on. After the party was over, Nathan would go back to his house and he would tell his wife about this crazy coincidence he and his sister had, and his wife would say, yeah, that's wild. But after that, Nathan just did not want to think about it or talk about it, and so he kind of just, pushed it out of his mental space and did forget about it. He moved on. 5 months later, in August of 2006, Nathan's mom would move out of that apartment building and she would move into a 2-story house still in Elk Grove, California. Shortly after she moved in, she asked Nathan if he would come spend a couple nights with her, and Nathan said sure. In order to better understand what happens to Nathan over the course of his stay at his mother's new house, you need to understand a basic layout of her house. So when you walk through her double doors, to your left is going to be a formal living room. In the center of the house is a hallway that shoots straight back to the kitchen. And then to your right when you walk in, there's a wall, and on that wall is the stairs leading up to the second floor. If you take those stairs to the second floor, you reach a landing where there's a window that looks back into the backyard, and immediately to your right, there is a single door, and that's the master bedroom where Nathan's mom would sleep. From the landing, if you turned left, there'd be another door that's a mirror image of the master bedroom door, and this door is the guest room. That's where Nathan was going to stay. And then to the left of the guest room was a hall that went to the front of the house, but that's irrelevant to the story. If you went inside the guest room, the bed was located in the back right corner. So the same layout as the guest room in the apartment building, where the person laying in the bed, so Nathan, his feet would be closest to the door. And from Nathan's perspective in the bed, the only other piece of furniture in this new house guest room was a table that was, from his perspective, on the right-hand wall, centered on the wall, and on the table was a TV. So that's the only things in the room. The first night Nathan was at this new house was totally uneventful. The second night, not so much. He was up in the guest room, laying on the bed, watching TV. The lights are off, it's just the TV on, and at some point, he dozes off. He wakes up a short time later, and he can't move. It's the same sensation he had when he was staying with his mom at her apartment. And he begins to panic because the last time he felt this way, a strange, veiled woman stood on his chest and made it feel like he was dying. And so immediately, he's trying to move his body, he can't, and so using his eyes, he starts looking around the room, praying this woman is not in the room with him. And so he looks to the right, to that corner, which he can see, there's no one there. From this corner, he starts scanning across the room. He sees the TV, it's still on. He keeps scanning and he sees the door and it's open. And then he scans and he's able to just barely make out the space at the foot of the bed. He can actually see to the corner, and this woman, she's not in here. And so initially, he feels incredibly relieved that she's not in the room with him. But then he finds himself focusing on the open door into the dark hallway. And he's thinking to himself, please do not come walking through that door. And so he stares at the open door, just hoping he breaks out of the sleep paralysis when he notices something about the TV. It's flickering. And so he averts his gaze to the TV and he realizes what he's looking at on TV does not look familiar. It does not look like a TV show. It looks like CCTV camera footage, like it looks like a security camera footage. And he realizes the footage he's looking at is the inside of his mother's kitchen downstairs. He recognized the way it was laid out. That's his mother's house. That's downstairs. and he's staring at the footage thinking, why is this footage playing on the TV? And I don't think there's a camera down there. When he notices on the camera, the woman with the veil walks into the middle of the frame, and she looks up at the camera right as the camera turns off. And then the room is completely dark. There's no more ambient light in the room. The hallway is dark, and he's left paralyzed knowing this woman is downstairs in the kitchen. And as he's laying there, he hears her start running through the house. And it sounds like an animal is barreling into things as she's running through the bottom floor, and she stops at the foot of the stairs. And he's thinking to himself, I know where she's going. She's coming up to my room. And so as he's laying there, he feels his heart racing and he's staring at the open door. He knows she's going to come flying up those stairs and she's going to come through that door. And instead of running up the stairs, he hears her take 1 step, 2 step. And as she's making her way up the stairs, he's just thinking, please break out of this trance. Stop this paralysis. Wake up, wake up. And then he sees her head emerge, and she turns to look at him from the stairs into the room. And once she sees it's him, she bolts around and starts charging into the room on all fours like an animal. At this point, Nathan lets out a primal scream. He is scared for his life as this woman is charging towards him, and she stops dead in her tracks right in the middle of the room. She looks at him, turns around, and crashes out of the room, charges downstairs, and then it's silent. As soon as she was downstairs, Nathan could sit up, except it did not feel like the first time he had sleep paralysis at his mom's apartment when he sat up and he had the sensation of relief. You've woken up. You were asleep before. Now you're awake. This time, it was like he was always awake, but now he can sit up. He did not have a sense of relief. In fact, he was worried she was still in the house. And as he's sitting up in bed, his mother comes running into the room. She looks disheveled. She's half asleep. And she's like, was that you? Were you running around the house? I could have sworn I heard someone running around the house. Was that you? Nathan's looking at her and he can't even process what he's been through, whether that was real, whether it was a dream. And he's trying to find the words to describe to his mom the dream he had. Like he can't process what's happening. And he just says, Mom, we have to check the house. We have to make sure no one's in the house. And so the two of them flip on every light upstairs. They're not even talking. At this point, it's survival mode. They turn on all the lights upstairs, and Nathan leads the way down. They're flicking on all the lights, and they manage to search the whole house, and there's no sign of a break-in. There's no one in their house. After the coast was clear and they felt like they were not in immediate danger, they went into the kitchen to kind of talk about what just happened. And so Nathan's like, okay, Mom, I just gotta tell you everything that I'm thinking right now. I can't really process what just happened. I think it was a bad dream, but I'm starting to think that it could be something else, or I'm just losing my mind. So a few months ago, I was sleeping in your guest room in your apartment, and I had an experience that I'm almost positive was sleep paralysis. You know, I was laying there, I couldn't move, and this figure was in the room and they were standing on me. It was terrifying, but it sounded an awful lot like sleep paralysis. But then a couple months after that, I talked to my sister and I told her about it. And she told me that very recently, right before you moved into this house, actually, she was in that room and she also had basically the exact same experience. She had never had sleep paralysis before. I had never had sleep paralysis before. So we've basically had the exact same horrifying experience in the same room around the same time. And then just now, tonight, I had another sleep paralysis experience with the same woman who was running around the house, and you just said you heard her running around the house. His mom looked really concerned, but she wasn't shocked. She says to Nathan, I have seen this woman. I saw her in my apartment way long time ago, but I remember what you're describing. That's the experience I had. This woman, showed up in the room and she stood on me. And it scared the heck out of me, but I didn't tell anyone because I thought it was sleep paralysis. And so Nathan and his mom proceeded to spend the next several hours just talking through what this could be. How could they, all three of them, him, his mom, and his sister, how could all of them have had the exact same experience? And how could tonight, when Nathan had this experience, how could his mom have heard those footsteps if that was indeed sleep paralysis? Because it wasn't Nathan, he was in the bedroom. And it wasn't his mom, she was in her bedroom. And she didn't have any pets, so who could it be? Nathan says he and his family are still totally rattled by this experience, and they don't have an answer. And this is a family of skeptics, so they're not looking for a reason to call this paranormal. They simply don't have the answers. Nathan has said that he, his mom, and his sister have not had any further experiences with the woman in black ever since that last experience Nathan had, and they're just hoping it stays that way.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of them are not available on this podcast. They're only on YouTube. Again, the YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 2 spooky stories about messages from beyond. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Wrong Path Home, and it's about a news report with a frightening secret message. The second and final story you'll hear is called Mother Knows Best, and it's about one of the very few credible paranormal encounters in American history. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the follow button a tuna sandwich, but instead of using tuna made for people, go ahead and use a can of cat food. Okay, let's get into our first story called Wrong Path Home.
At around 9 p.m. on October 26, 2009, a 19-year-old college student named Miyako Hiroka bagged up the last bit of trash inside of the ice cream parlor where she worked, and she dumped it into a bag and she tied that bag up. It was closing time, and so Miyako looked around the inside of the parlor, made sure everything was where it was supposed to be, and then she flipped off the lights, threw her purse over her shoulder, she grabbed that bag of trash, she headed outside the parlor, she shut and locked the door, she dumped the trash in a nearby bin, and then began walking towards the exit of the mall, which is where this parlor was located. It was inside of this big mall. Miyako went to school in a city called Hamada City, which is located on the coast of Japan in an area called the Shimane Prefecture. And Hamada City was a totally beautiful and very remote location with these amazing beaches and unbelievable mountains with all these ski resorts on it. I mean, this was an incredible place to live. But as much as Miyako did love living there, she was actually far more excited about where she'd be living the next year because she was doing an exchange program. She'd be studying in Russia, and that was so exciting for her. And in fact, this exchange program was the reason why Miyako had picked up this job at this ice cream parlor, because she came from a family that was not poor by any means, but they didn't have a lot of extra income, and Miyako felt strongly that she really wanted to pay her way to go do this big Russian exchange program because it wasn't cheap, and so she was picking up as many shifts as she could to save up money to pay her way. And so Miyako eventually reached the exit of this mall, and she stepped outside into the night, and then she had a decision she needed to make. And she needed to make this decision every night after work. There were 2 ways that she could get back to her dorm, which was located about a mile away. The quick way would be to just hop on a bus and have the bus take her to her dorm, but that cost money. And remember, Miyako is trying to save up as much money as she can to pay for Russia next year. And so taking the bus just felt like, not really worth it. And the other option, which was free, was much longer and frankly just plain spooky. And Miyako hated it. What it entailed was basically just walking to her dorm, but it would mean walking for about 1/3 of a mile through this really spooky forest that looked like it was straight out of a horror movie. Now, up until recently, Miyako's coworker had always left with her at the same time, and they lived roughly in the same area, and so they would walk together through that forest, saving money, and also, providing each other security as they went through the spooky area. But recently, the coworker had quit, and so now Miyako was all alone. And so as Miyako stood there wondering what she should do, take the bus route or take the forest route, she just thought about, next year, it's all going to be worth it. I'm going to go to Russia. I'm going to pay my way. It's going to be awesome. And after all, what's the worst that can happen? It's just a few minutes walking through a forest I've done dozens of times. Before long, I'll be in my brightly lit, safe dorm room studying away, and everything will be fine. And so Miyako turned and began walking towards the forest. The following day, a little past 4 p.m., the owner of the ice cream shop where Miyako worked was standing inside the parlor feeling really annoyed because Miyako had not shown up for her shift, and now the owner, who normally did a lot of administrative and managerial things, was stuck at the counter serving all the customers, basically doing Miyako's job. But when 5 p.m. came and still Miyako had not shown up, and the owner had tried calling her and she didn't pick up, and there was just no sign of her, the owner went from being annoyed to being somewhat worried. And so after again not being able to call Miyako to figure out what was going on, he wound up going through her file and finding her mother's phone number, and he called her. And when he spoke to Miyako's mother, he knew right away there was something wrong. Because Miyako's mother actually was pretty panicked, and she said, you know what? Last night when Miyako was coming home from work, she told me she would call me when she got to her dorm, but I never heard from her, and I haven't been able to get in touch with her since. And so after this conversation ended, Miyako's mother would call the police and report her daughter missing. And pretty much instantly, the police in Hamada City responded in force. I mean, they launched a huge investigation to go figure out what happened to Miyako. And really the reason behind that is because Hamada City is this unbelievable place, this secluded, safe place where things like this did not happen. And frankly, it scared everybody, and they wanted to deal with it as quickly as possible. And so what police did at first is they went and looked at security footage from the ice cream parlor where they knew she had been working on the night she went missing. And sure enough, at about 9:16 p.m., there's footage of her walking out of the ice cream parlor in the mall. She's got a purse over her shoulder and, she shuts and locks the door. She throws the trash away, and then she heads towards the exit. But after that, nobody saw her. There was no more footage. There was no more tips or anything. She just vanished once she left the mall. And so very quickly, this story gained lots of attention because again, Hamada City is like this quintessential vacation spot. It's so perfect. It's so safe. And to have this girl just go missing, it was scandalous. And so it made the news all over Hamada City. And also people who lived in Hamada City were suddenly on edge at night. What's out there snatching people up? In fact, Miyako's college, during the few days following her disappearance, they set a curfew for all their students. Like all their students had to be back in their dorms at a certain time to keep them safe. But again, despite the police really leaning into this case from the jump and putting all their manpower and all their resources into this, they really had no idea what happened to Miyako. Then, on November 6th, 2009, so 11 days after Miyako went missing, a man who was hunting for mushrooms up on this mountainside about 15 miles away from the ice cream parlor believed he spotted this beautiful mushroom sitting underneath a few fallen leaves. And so excited, the guy runs over and he begins moving away the leaves to grab this big meaty mushroom. But as soon as he grabbed the skin of this mushroom and began to pull, he stopped. And then he quickly turned and began sprinting back down the path that had brought him up here. And as he was running, he pulled his phone out and he saw he had no service, and he just kept on running and holding the phone up looking for service. And then finally, when he was about halfway down the mountain, he saw he had service in his phone and he called the police. And the second the dispatcher answered, this man began screaming, "I found a human head!" When police arrived on that mountainside where this man claimed to have found a human head, well, they confirmed he was right. They found Miyako's severed head right underneath those leaves. And the reason this guy thought her head was a mushroom, a dark-colored mushroom, because it was obvious that Miyako's face had been so badly beaten and it was all black and blue before she lost her head. And so this mushroom hunter had literally thought that was a big, big mushroom. And so at this point, the Hamada City police shifted their area of search from around the mall and the ice cream parlor where they thought they would find Miyako to this forested mountain area where her head was found. And now, of course, it was no longer a search and rescue. It was a recovery mission. They're just looking for the rest of Miyako's body. And over the next couple of days, as police searched this forested mountainside, they would find different parts of Miyako all over the place. And then after they had found, all the pieces to Miyako, the running theory based on what they were seeing is that very likely she had been strangled to death, and then her body was burned, and then she was dismembered and scattered throughout this forested mountain area. But there was very little evidence about who had actually done this to Miyako. Miyako had no enemies to speak of. Everybody who spoke about Miyako said she was incredibly lovely and kind, and really there wasn't anybody in her life that would want to do her harm. And also because Miyako's body had been destroyed and left out for so long, any trace evidence left behind by her killer or killers was basically non-existent. And so the police really had no leads to speak of. They had no suspects or anything. And so they called in psychologists to try to make, a profile of who they thought might have done this. And the best theory anyone could come up with was that this had been a random crime of opportunity, that the person who killed her didn't know her, and that likely her killer was a man who was likely between the ages of 20 and 40. But even that information really didn't narrow anything down, and so quickly, this case began to go cold. But as the police investigation itself began to go cold, the kind of lore around this story was only growing. I mean, this really seemed like a totally unbelievable case, considering where it happened. I mean, Hamada City is like this perfect place. How could this happen here? And so what started as being kind of a local news story, albeit a big local news story, became a major national story all over Japan. And so all these TV outlets and journalists were descending on Hamada City, and they were taking video of the ice cream parlor and of the police department, and filming, Miyako's dorm and her school and her parents' house. I mean, there were people all over the place trying to get any bit of information to report on about this case. And despite there being dozens and dozens of these live reports basically every day coming out of Hamada City about this case and about Miyako, there was one particular news report that took this case from being, totally unfortunate and sad and tragic and horrible to completely unbelievable and bizarre. Shortly after Miyako's remains had basically all been found, but they were still doing some recovery operations up on that mountainside, one of these kind of random TV reporters who was in Hamada City to report on this crazy case decided to set up their TV camera so it was pointing towards the dark entrance of that spooky forest that Miyako would walk through to get back to her dorm. And so this TV news reporter's got their microphone and, they're standing with the forest entrance right behind them, and the cameraman's filming, looking towards this opening of the forest. And the actual report was pretty generic. I mean, this reporter was basically saying, well, coming at you live from Hamada City, just outside of the forest where perhaps Miyako was killed. And it was just like that. It was just kind of talking about the case, and there was nothing to it. At least not to the TV reporter and the cameraman who were on site. Because for them, the entire report was pretty routine. They did their job, they got their shot, they got their report, and then they left. But they streamed it live. So while they were doing it, all these people are tuned in watching this news report live in front of this forest. And something really unsettling happened on this broadcast. While that news reporter was talking, another voice began to be heard by people watching this broadcast. And it was not the cameraman, and it was certainly not the TV journalist. It was a woman's voice. And there was no woman anywhere near the shot. And after the fact, the journalist and the cameraman would also attest that there was nobody around. It was just them. But this detached, very pained voice said very clearly, and all these people heard it live, "This is very painful. Why only me?" And so after this news report happened, this story, this case about Miyako, went from being just a Japanese story to being like an international sensation. Because everybody believed when they saw this video that that voice that was heard was Miyako's ghost, basically talking on camera. That's why you can't see her. It's her spirit communicating with the living world. However, despite that drawing even more attention to this case, it didn't remotely help the police actually solve the case. They still had no idea who did this. And that's how this case would stay for years, just totally stalled. That is, until 7 years later, when a police officer was conducting a routine police review of old criminal case files that hadn't been solved, going through them all to see if maybe evidence had been missed, and maybe that was why the case had not been solved. And so this police officer is looking through all these case files, and when they landed on the Miyako case, they did discover a piece of evidence that had been totally overlooked. It was the file of a convicted sex offender named Yoshiharu Yano. Yoshiharu was a 33-year-old man who had served time in prison for assaults on 3 different women in Tokyo, which is 500 miles away from Hamada City, where Miyako was killed. And because of that 500-mile gap between Tokyo and Hamada City, Yoshiharu had been completely overlooked in terms of being a suspect in Miyako's murder. It just seemed like he was too far away to be involved. But the police officer who was doing that routine review, they discovered that right before Miyako was murdered, this Yoshiharu guy had been let out of prison and decided to live in Hamada City. And on the night Miyako was killed, when she decided to walk into that forest, well, they found security footage of Yoshiharu's car driving along around that forest and up near that mountain where Miyako's remains were all discovered. And so this investigator who discovered this piece of information got permission from higher-ups to search Yoshiharu's home where he was living right then. And when they searched his home, they discovered a digital camera with 40 photos on it that would explain what happened to Miyako. It was very clear Yoshiharu had murdered Miyako because some of the pictures contain photos of Miyako and they are just horrible. But figuring out who Miyako's killer was not the end of this case. In fact, it wasn't even the most shocking part of this case. The most shocking part of this case is what happened to Miyako's killer, Yoshiharu, basically right after she was murdered, and that voice, that detached female voice, was heard on that TV news report. 7 years earlier, right around the time that Miyako's head had been found, and also after that voice had been heard on the TV newscast, some people who were driving in a car north of Hamada City began calling the police to report something very strange. They called the police and said, there is this small white Toyota Corolla car that has 2 people inside of it, and they've driven to the side of the road, and the driver is ramming over and over again against the railing. Like they're smashing into the railing, backing up, smashing over and over again, like the car is somehow in control. They don't understand how these people are not getting out of the car. Like, what are they doing? Traffic had stopped on either side. It was just totally nonsensical. And then by the time the police showed up, this car that was just repeatedly driving into the side of this guardrail, it burst into flames with the 2 people inside still clearly alive and looking terrified, and they caught on fire and died. Now, at the time, this did make the news. It looked very much like some sort of weird murder-suicide where the driver had intentionally, driven the car until it burst into flames and killed themselves and also their passenger. But it didn't really amount to more than just a really weird news story because there was no connection to the Miyako case. This is like a totally isolated thing. However, 7 years later, when that police officer discovered the link that Yoshiharu was in Hamada City, and then they figured out, yep, Yoshiharu was the killer, well, suddenly, that totally weird murder-suicide took on a whole new meaning. Because the driver of that car was Yoshiharu, and the passenger was his mother. And again, from eyewitness testimony, it didn't really make sense the way this all happened. It was almost like the car was possessed or something, that, the passengers couldn't control it. Now, who knows if that's true, but when you combine it with the sound of that female voice on the TV news camera that everybody assumed was Miyako's ghost saying, "This is so painful, why only me?" suddenly those words took on a new meaning. People thought, you know what it is? Miyako's ghost must have taken control of that car and made sure not only Yoshiharu suffered and died, but his family member died as well, that she was seeking her revenge on her killer.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Mother Knows Best.
In the early evening of January 23rd, 1897, a blacksmith named Erasmus Shue stoked his fire inside of his little shop in rural West Virginia and then called out to his 11-year-old helper who was in the back cleaning up. Erasmus had been planning to head home early that night. However, a last-minute order for horseshoes had just come in, and so Erasmus knew that was not going to happen. He was going to have to work late. And so he was calling for his helper to send the helper to his home, Erasmus's home, to check on Erasmus's wife, Zona. He wanted to make sure that 1, Zona knew he would be late, and 2, if Zona needed anything, the helper could go out and get it for her or help around the house or whatever she needed. After the helper had left, Erasmus went back to poking at his fire, but his mind was not on the horseshoes he needed to make. Instead, it was on his wife, Zona. The couple hadn't told anyone yet, but Zona was pregnant. Erasmus and Zona had only just met a couple of months earlier, but they had fallen in love very quickly. Zona was 23 years old, and she had beautiful dark hair and dark eyes and a quick sense of humor. She was a total free spirit who had grown up on a farm, and she had never really been away from home. When Erasmus had arrived in the little village called Livesey's Mill, which was located near a river at the foot of this mountain and was right near where Zona lived, he and Zona had noticed each other right away. Erasmus, who was quite a bit older than Zona, he was 35 years old, was tall and handsome with piercing blue eyes, and he had come to this little rural town to set up his blacksmith shop. And to Zona, he was like this amazing, new, exciting thing. Zona's family, especially her mother, Mary Jane, did not approve of the fact that Zona and Erasmus had begun seeing each other, mostly because Mary Jane didn't like the fact that Erasmus was so much older than Zona, but Zona was known for being incredibly stubborn, and she loved Erasmus, and so there was just no stopping her. So, in November, just a couple of months after meeting each other, Zona and Erasmus got married and they moved into a little house together, and very quickly, Zona got pregnant. And both she and Erasmus were so excited about this that they wanted to go around and tell people, but early on, it was clear Zona had some complications with this pregnancy. She was sick all the time, and she just seemed really unwell, and the doctor who was seeing her knew that it likely had to do with her pregnancy. And so the couple decided that they should just wait and let the pregnancy develop a bit before announcing the news. So, on this late January day, Erasmus began hustling to finish these horseshoes because he really wanted to get home and be there for Zona and make sure she really was okay. And so as Erasmus thought about Zona, the steel he was heating inside of this fire was glowing bright orange and was ready to be forged into shape. And so Erasmus got his hammer and he got to work. Meanwhile, Erasmus's 11-year-old helper had arrived at Erasmus and Zona's house, and the helper walked through the gate up to the front door of this little 2-story home, and he knocked on the front door. But Zona did not come to the door, which the helper thought was odd, because Zona was someone who was always bustling around the home and was very quick to open the door and chat with neighbors. And now, standing in front of this door, the helper couldn't even hear a sound inside of the house. It was like no one was home. And so the helper knocked again, and after some more silence, he just reached down and tried the doorknob and found it was unlocked, and so he swung the door in. And right away, the helper noticed that the house was totally dark. None of the lamps were lit, even though the sun was setting fast. And so the helper stepped inside of the house and continued to call out for Mrs. Shu, but there was no answer. And at some point, as the helper turned a corner and looked towards the base of the stairs that led up to the second level, he froze. Because lying on the ground was Zona. She was lying perpendicular to how the stairs run, on her back with one arm over her chest, like she was sleeping at the foot of the stairs. And so at this point, the helper is scared. He doesn't know what's going on here. Obviously something is wrong. And so very slowly, the helper began moving closer and closer to Zona. And when he was practically right on top of her, he yelled out her name one more time. And when she didn't call back and her chest wasn't moving and she was just totally still, he knew, obviously, something was terribly wrong. And so the helper at this point turned around and sprinted out of the house and ran back to his own house. And when he got there, he ran inside and he told his mother that he thought Mrs. Shu, Zona, was dead. And so the mother told the helper, run back to the blacksmith shop and tell Erasmus to go home right now. I'll get the doctor. It would take the local doctor, the same one who had been treating Zona for her pregnancy complications, almost an hour to finally get to Zona's house. And when the doctor arrived, he found the 11-year-old helper and his mother and other neighbors kind of clustered around in the first floor of the home. And then when he went up to the second floor into the master bedroom, he found Erasmus, who by this point had returned, and he was sitting on his bed, and he had laid out his wife, Zona, so that she was on her back and her head was in his arms, and he was stroking her hair and rocking back and forth and crying. The doctor, of course, knew Zona and Erasmus very well because of how often he had been treating Zona for her pregnancy issues over these last few weeks, and so he felt a pit of sadness looking at this scene, but he knew he had to do his job, and so he gently walked over and he put his hand on Erasmus's shoulder, and he just said, I need to examine Zona's body. And Erasmus, at this point, he didn't even look up. He just continued to sob and rock back and forth while stroking her hair. Finally, the doctor kind of was a bit more forceful in asking Erasmus to step aside, at which point Erasmus did. He got out of the way and positioned Zona flat on the bed, and he made sure her hair was perfectly combed all around her neck. And then Erasmus knelt down right next to the bed and continued stroking his wife's hair and crying, while the doctor at this point kind of moved to the foot of the bed and began looking at Zona and beginning his examination. And the doctor would quickly confirm that yes, Zona was dead. And after looking at her pelvis and kind of moving her around, the doctor came to the conclusion that very likely Zona had passed away from pregnancy complications. Zona's funeral would be held the next day at the local cemetery at the top of this hilltop. And by this point, the word had gotten out that Zona had been pregnant when she died. And so during this funeral, everybody was staring at Erasmus, who was overcome with grief and crying so hard that he could barely catch his breath. And then right before they lowered Zona's casket into the ground, Erasmus made a point of putting his wife's favorite scarf into the coffin with her. He said his final goodbyes, he shut the casket, and then it was lowered into the ground. But while the mourners were obviously very moved by just how unbelievably grief-stricken Erasmus was, I mean, his whole family was wiped out in one blow, what really stood out to the people that attended that funeral was not Erasmus's reaction to his wife's death, but rather Zona's mother's reaction to Erasmus. During this funeral, Mary Jane, Zona's mother, didn't seem sad or grief-stricken or in any way reacting to the fact that her daughter had died. Instead, as the funeral went on, Mary Jane shamelessly glared at Erasmus with a look of pure hate and disgust on her face. And then, after the funeral was over, all the mourners wanted to go up to Mary Jane and Erasmus to pay their final respects to the family, but Mary Jane ignored all these people and promptly left the funeral without saying a word to anyone. And in the days that followed Zona's funeral, Mary Jane's behavior only continued to get more and more bizarre. When neighbors would drop by Mary Jane's house to drop off food or just check in on her, Mary Jane refused to come to the door. Mary Jane basically began staying up all night. People would see there were candles lit in her bedroom at all hours, and they'd see her pacing around her room and then periodically kneeling on the ground and kind of staring off into the distance. And then on the rare occasion that Mary Jane actually left her house, she would look totally disheveled and distracted, and as she walked around town, she'd be mumbling under her breath and constantly looking over her shoulder like she was scared someone was following her. And when concerned neighbors came up to Mary when she was out of her house, she refused to make eye contact with them, didn't want to talk to them, and as fast as she could would get away from them. Whatever was going on with Mary Jane, her husband was not willing to talk about it to other people in town. However, they did notice that he had begun sleeping in the barn, so he was not even staying in the house with his wife. And then, on the morning of February 21st, so about a month after Zona had died, Mary Jane walked out of her house looking totally clean-cut. She was not disheveled. She was not looking over her shoulder. She wasn't muttering to herself. She was standing tall, moving with a purpose, looking totally coherent. And as she moved, the only emotion people could see on her face was anger. And so Mary Jane, angrily, walking with a purpose, walked her way to the local prosecutor's office. And instead of knocking and waiting to be let inside, she just opened the door and barged right inside. The prosecutor knew Mary Jane and knew how strange she had been acting over these last few weeks. And so when she came inside, he was alarmed at her sudden presence, but he was also pretty curious as to what was going on. And so when she came in and demanded to speak to him, he was happy to go into his office and take a meeting kind of simply out of curiosity. But once the two of them sat down in his office, Mary Jane proceeded to tell this prosecutor this totally outlandish story about her dead daughter, Zona, that at first made the prosecutor think, okay, clearly Mary Jane has lost her mind. That's what's been going on over the past few weeks. All this grief of losing her daughter has caused her to kind of snap. But by the end of these 2 hours that Mary Jane seemed to just be kind of rambling about this story about her daughter, the prosecutor started to realize that what she was saying kind of made a lot of sense, and his suspicions began to rise and rise. And so once Mary Jane was done telling this wild story about Zona, the prosecutor was convinced that what Mary Jane was saying had to be true, and so he knew they needed to dig Zona up. And so after Mary Jane had left, the prosecutor ran to the local doctor's house, the same doctor who had been treating Zona and then also looked at her after she died. And the prosecutor would tell the doctor that, hey, we need to exhume Zona and you need to examine her again. And the doctor at first was like, wait a minute, what's going on here? But then after hearing what the prosecutor had to say about this crazy story that Mary Jane had just told him, the doctor agreed that, okay, yeah, we do need to do this. And so the next day, February 22nd, a team of men with shovels, along with the prosecutor and the doctor, headed up to the Hilltop Cemetery where Zona was buried, and they dug her casket up, and then they carried the casket down to the local schoolhouse, and then once she was inside, the workers lifted her body, which was fairly well preserved because the ground was so cold. They lifted her body out and they placed it on a table, and then everybody left except for the doctor and the prosecutor. And once the room was clear, the doctor and the prosecutor began examining Zona all over again. And within about 30 seconds of this re-examination of Zona's body, basically at the exact same time, the doctor and the prosecutor, who were on either sides of the body, saw the thing that Mary Jane had alluded to in her wild story about her daughter. And so the doctor and the prosecutor, they're seeing this thing, they look up at each other and they can't believe it. Mary Jane's story had to be true. The following is Mary Jane's wild story. On the day of Zona's funeral, even though Mary Jane was overcome with grief over losing her daughter, the feeling that she really was harboring was hatred towards Erasmus. She hated Erasmus, she had always hated him, but now it was like her daughter is dead and she's forced to watch this guy sob and cry over her daughter's casket, when in her mind she's like, this funeral is about her, it's not about you. And so the whole funeral, she's just staring at Erasmus, channeling all of her energy towards hating him. But then, as she's doing this, a new emotion began to creep up on her that she couldn't quite describe. Basically, it felt like something was terribly wrong. And intuitively, Mary Jane felt like the only person who could explain what this thing was that was wrong kind of in her life somewhere was her daughter, Zona, who was obviously dead. And so this feeling that something is terribly wrong, it completely consumed Mary Jane's mind. And so by the end of the funeral, she wasn't mad at Erasmus. She was just thinking, how do I get in touch with my daughter? I need to get answers from my daughter. And so when the funeral ended, Mary Jane just left the funeral as fast as she could. She went home, she went into her bedroom, and she knelt down and she began to pray. Not for peace or strength in this difficult time, but instead, she prayed for her daughter's ghost to appear to her and tell her what was wrong. And for the next month, that is all Mary Jane did. She was obsessed with this idea that she needed to basically conjure her daughter's ghost to tell her what this thing was that was wrong. And so that was why she was acting totally crazy. All she did was pray and then look for signs that her daughter's ghost had come or was on her way. And so she'd be up all night, kind of looking around, hoping her daughter would suddenly appear. And then when she would go outside, the reason she was muttering is because she was still praying under her breath. And she was always looking over her shoulders because she thought her daughter would appear any moment. And then, finally, one night in the middle of February, so this is a month into Mary Jane's attempts to conjure her daughter's ghost, she was in her room, she was praying like she normally did with all of her candles lit, and all of a sudden, as she's kneeling down praying, this bright light appears in the middle of her room. And as this light suddenly appeared, the room began to get really cold. And Mary Jane is staring at this light thinking, this is my daughter. But then just as quickly as the light and the cold that came with it had appeared, it disappeared. And so Mary Jane was both really excited because she felt like, okay, the prayers are working. That had to be my daughter's ghost or some sign that my daughter's ghost is going to come here. And so Mary Jane just doubled down on her prayers. She knew she was close to getting her daughter to show up. And so over the next 2 days, that bright light would appear 2 more times, and each time it would just quickly disappear. But again, Mary Jane is thinking, okay, something's happening, my prayers are working. And then finally, on the 4th night, as Mary Jane is in her bedroom praying, the light appears in the middle of her room, it starts to get cold, but then instead of the light disappearing, Mary Jane would describe seeing her daughter kind of step out of this light and suddenly appear in the room. Mary Jane said that her daughter was dressed all in black and her skin was very pale and her eyes were these dark pits and her hair was straight down right over her shoulders and she was staring at her mother. And Mary Jane, when she saw this, even though she had been trying for a month to get her daughter's ghost to appear, now that it seemed to be happening, she was terrified. And so Mary Jane began backing up right as this ghost begins walking towards Mary Jane. But then Mary Jane, as she's up against the wall, tells herself, you have to be strong. You need to talk to the ghost. You need to figure out what's wrong. And the only question that Mary Jane was able to come up with was, how did you die? And when she asked this question, Zona's ghost came to a stop. And then when Zona opened her mouth, dirt poured out. And then with a raspy, low voice, she began to tell her mother a story. She told her that Erasmus appeared to be this wonderful person to the community, but behind closed doors, he was a monster. He hit her and screamed at her over the littlest things, and then on the night of January 22nd, so one day before Zona would be discovered at the base of the stairs by Erasmus's helper, Zona's ghost would tell Mary Jane that Erasmus had become enraged at Zona over the food she had made that night for dinner. He had wanted meat, and she had made something else, and so he was furious. And when Zona tried to tell Erasmus that she would make more food, or there was other food for him to eat, to just please calm down, Erasmus stood up and he grabbed Zona by the neck and he lifted her off the ground. And right at this moment in this story that Zona's ghost is telling Mary Jane, the ghost would stop speaking. And this look of abject terror would come across the ghost's face, as if she was suddenly reliving this moment that happened with Erasmus. And as she's standing there with this horrible look on her face, the ghost began to levitate off the ground, and then it opened its mouth. And as it did, no sound came out, but instead, it was like all the air in the room was getting sucked into this ghost's open mouth. And then all of a sudden, there was this loud cracking sound as the ghost's head suddenly violently whipped around 180 degrees, but the ghost's body was still facing towards Mary Jane. And after this happened, Mary Jane is sitting there totally dumbstruck, and the ghost suddenly drops back down onto the ground, still with their chest facing Mary Jane, but their face pointing behind them. And then Zona's ghost turned around and began walking out of the room, and because she had turned her body around, that meant her head, which was facing the wrong way, was now oriented towards Mary Jane again, and Mary Jane would say the ghost was smiling. And then right before Zona's ghost left, she would say to her mother, "Now do you see what he did to me?" And then Zona just vanished and the room became warm again, and Mary Jane, who was suddenly feeling so exhausted, just sat down on the bed and wept. Mary Jane had, the next morning, promptly gotten up and rushed to the prosecutor's office and told him the story of seeing her daughter's ghost and how the ghost had told her that Erasmus had throttled her and that was what killed her. Now, the prosecutor was really moved by Mary Jane's story, but it was when he rushed to the doctor to ask about re-examining Zona's body to see if she had marks on her neck from where she could have been throttled. That was when the doctor actually told the prosecutor that when he did the examination of Zona's body on the day she was found, he would say that Erasmus spent the entire examination at the head of the bed, cradling Zona's head and brushing her hair, but now that he was thinking about it, he could have been covering up her neck with the hair. And then also they thought about the funeral when, right before Zona was lowered into the ground, Erasmus placed a scarf claiming it was his wife's favorite around her neck when she was buried. Again, perhaps trying to conceal the fact that there were marks on her neck. And when they did exhume Zona's body and they removed that scarf that Erasmus had placed, they would see there were marks all over her neck that looked like fingerprints. And then upon further examination, they would see that her neck was actually dislocated and that her windpipe had been crushed. Erasmus would be arrested for the murder of his wife just minutes after the doctor and prosecutor, basically at the same time, saw the marks on Zona's neck during their re-examination. During Erasmus's trial, Mary Jane would take the stand and she would tell the story of her daughter's ghost coming to her and explaining that Erasmus had killed her. And the testimony was so compelling that the jury found Erasmus guilty, even though there was no motive. Basically, they convicted him on the strength of Mary Jane's ghost story. Erasmus would be sentenced to life in prison, but he would die just 3 years after being incarcerated from a mystery illness that passed through the prison. It would also turn out that Erasmus had been married 2 times before marrying Zona. One of his wives had divorced him for being abusive. The other wife died in a freak accident when she was helping Erasmus fix their chimney when all of a sudden a brick fell loose and hit her in the head. Today, there is a plaque right near the cemetery in West Virginia where Zona was buried that reads in part, "Only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer."
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, not just this one, but also Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform, and you'll find all of them. If you want to watch hundreds more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, just head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On March 25th, 2009, Sergeant Jimmy Edmonds responded to a robbery call at a house in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Georgia. Now, Edmonds thought he was just going to investigate a routine break-in, but once he stepped foot inside of that house, he discovered the most violent crime scene he'd ever witnessed in his entire law enforcement career. For the next 3 days, Edmonds would barely sleep, but he would eventually uncover the truth about what happened in that house of horrors. And let's just say the truth was not what anybody expected. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, this summer, right before it gets really hot, be sure you remove all of the Freon from the follow button's car. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of March 25th, 2009, 41-year-old Kay Parsons woke up in her bedroom in the quiet suburb of Grovetown, Georgia. It was still dark outside, but Kay knew she had a busy morning ahead of her. So she got right out of bed and walked down the hallway to wake up her son. When she went into his room, her son, who was 12 years old, immediately began complaining that he didn't want to wake up yet, but Kay just flipped on his lights and said, "Come on, you gotta get ready for school." Once Kay saw her son actually climb out of bed and begin to get dressed, she rushed downstairs and poured him a bowl of cereal and left it on the table, and then called up to him and said, "Come on, come down, eat your breakfast." And then Kay rushed right back upstairs into her bedroom to get dressed. Now, normally, Kay had help with the morning routine from her husband, David. But David was in Los Angeles on business. David was a career military man who had become a successful civilian contractor after retirement, which meant David worked for the military, but he was not actually a member of the military. And generally speaking, civilian contractors with the military make a lot of money. David's work at a nearby army base is what had brought the family to Georgia 4 years earlier, and his job had allowed them to buy their beautiful 2-story, 4-bedroom home. But the trade-off with David's financial success was that he often had to travel for work, leaving Kay to manage on her own. Most of the time, Kay was perfectly happy to take on everything at home by herself because she knew David was doing his part for the family in other ways. Kay and David had been together since they were in high school, and people who knew them said they had the kind of partnership that made other couples jealous. They seemed to function as this perfect unit, and they always knew how to help the other. But the truth was, behind the scenes, Kay and David were not perfect, and lately they had been going through a really rough patch. They'd been getting in these horrible fights, and then after the fights would end, they would just ignore each other for long periods of time. And so as Kay rushed around her bedroom getting dressed for the day, she couldn't help but feel kind of resentful towards David for not being here that morning to help her. But Kay quickly told herself she was being foolish. Even though they were fighting, she knew the reason David was gone was for work. He was there to help the family, and so she couldn't really be resentful about it. Once Kay was finished getting dressed, she ran to her son's bedroom and grabbed his backpack and then went back downstairs to the kitchen. When she got there, her son said he was done eating, so Kay handed him his backpack, then she grabbed his empty cereal bowl and put it in the sink, and then she picked up her white leather handbag off the counter and took out her car keys. Then Kay stopped herself because she knew she was running around like a maniac, and she took a breath and then looked over at her son and smiled. Even when she and David were not getting along, they still made sure their son always felt like their house was filled with love and happiness. Kay's son smiled back at her, and then the two of them walked to the garage and got into Kay's car. Kay pulled out of the garage onto Hot Springs Drive, her quiet neighborhood street. And as she did, she looked over at the house next door, another beautiful brick home, strikingly similar to her own. And in many ways, Kay and her family's lives in Grovetown were directly connected with that house next door. On the day that Kay, David, and their son had moved in, their next-door neighbors, Becky and Tony Sears, and their 5 kids, had dropped by with food to welcome them to their new home. From then on, the two households became inseparable. The adults played tennis together, one of the Sears boys was on the same baseball team as Kay's son, and the two families had vacationed together. Becky even got Kay a job at Healing Hands, the physical therapy clinic where she worked. And not long after Kay and Becky had begun working together, they joined Weight Watchers together. And Kay gave Becky a lot of credit for helping her meet her weight loss goals. Every day, Becky wanted to compare weights and discuss who had lost the most. It made Kay anxious, but she had to admit, peer pressure worked. But in recent weeks, Kay had been so caught up in the problems she was having with her husband that she really hadn't even spoken to Becky. And as Kay drove past Becky's house that morning, she wished she could go back in time to when everything had seemed so perfect. After Kay dropped her son off at school, she went to a McDonald's drive-thru. Even though Kay was a part of Weight Watchers and was trying to lose weight, when she was really stressed out or rushed, she often treated herself to fast food. Kay quickly ate her McDonald's breakfast in the car as she drove back home. She was in a hurry because her handyman, Mitch Cozart, would be arriving at her house soon. Mitch was coming by to repair the back door. But as Kay drove, she was thinking about other projects she might ask him to take care of while he was already at the house. And Kay was still lost in her own thoughts about what she was going to ask him to do when she pulled back into her 2-car garage at around 7:15 a.m. Kay got out of her car and walked into the house carrying a half-finished cup of McDonald's coffee and an empty fast food bag. And within seconds of stepping foot inside of her house, Kay heard a loud crashing sound in the kitchen. It sounded like something breaking. Kay had no idea how anything could be falling in her kitchen, and so she quickly rushed around the corner to see what was going on. But what she saw in the kitchen was the last thing she expected. At 8:30 a.m., Kay's handyman, Mitch, walked onto Kay's front porch and rang the doorbell. He knew Kay was expecting him, so he was surprised when no one answered the door. After a few moments, Mitch pulled out his flip phone and called Kay, but Kay didn't pick up. Mitch peeked in the windows of the home, but he couldn't see anyone inside the house, so he walked around to the back. He was there to fix the elegant French doors that were in the back of the house, and so he figured he could at least take a look at the job while he was waiting for Kay. But when Mitch came around the corner of the house and actually saw these French doors, he froze, because one of the panes of glass in the French doors was completely shattered and the French door was open. He called out for Kay from the outside, but no one answered. Mitch had seen enough cop shows to know that he did not want to go inside this house himself and potentially leave fingerprints or footprints, and so instead, Mitch grabbed his phone again and he called 911 to report what appeared to be a break-in. But as Mitch was talking to the 911 operator, he noticed this young man with black hair sitting on the other side of the road on this rock, just staring at Mitch. And then as soon as Mitch got off the phone, the young man with black hair called out to him. Mitch walked across the street towards him, and as he did, he could see the young man looked pretty shaken up. When Mitch finally reached the young man, he told Mitch his name was Michael Bowers, and he lived next door to Kay, and he was actually Kay's friend Becky's oldest son, who was from a previous marriage. Mitch asked Michael if he was okay, but Michael said no. He said he'd overheard Mitch's phone calls to 911, so he knew that Kay's house had been broken into, and he told Mitch that his own house had been broken into as well. He said the house was ransacked with drawers emptied onto the floor and the whole place was a mess. Michael said he had just called his mother at work to let her know. At this point, Mitch was very worried, and he told Michael to stay right where he was and to not go back inside of his house because whoever had broken in might still be there. Then Mitch went back across the street to his truck, and he pulled out the gun he kept in the glove compartment, just in case. Then he went back across the street and waited with Michael for the police to arrive. A few minutes later, Sergeant Jimmy Edmonds of the Columbia County Sheriff's Office arrived at Kay's house. His office had received 2 calls within minutes of each other to report break-ins in neighboring houses on Hot Springs Drive. Edmonds thought just 1 break-in would be very unusual for such a quiet, low-crime neighborhood, but 2 break-ins? Something strange was going on. Sheriff's deputies arrived on the scene soon after, and at that point, Edmonds walked around the house with them to the back door with the shattered glass. But before Edmonds even went inside the house, he saw an ominous sign. He could clearly see blood on the kitchen floor. Edmonds turned back around and looked at the deputies and made sure they saw the blood too, and they nodded, and then Edmonds led them into the house. And immediately Edmonds saw the blood trail went all the way out of the kitchen and down the front hall. And the blood was not just on the floor. There was also blood spattered all over the walls too. As Edmonds followed this grotesque blood trail all through the house, he passed by a spilled McDonald's coffee and a crumpled McDonald's bag and a white handbag on the floor. Then he saw a bloody handprint on the wall right beside the door to the garage, and he opened up the door. And there, lying beside her car in a big pool of blood, was Kay Parsons. Edmonds quickly rushed over and crouched down beside Kay and placed his fingers on the inside of her wrist, and amazingly, he found a pulse. Kay was alive, so Edmonds shouted for one of the deputies to call an ambulance. As Edmonds stayed crouched down with Kay, telling her over and over again that help was on the way, Edmonds just could not believe the amount of blood he was seeing, not just all over the house, but on Kay, on her face, her arms, her clothes. He had been investigating violent crime for years, but he'd never seen someone beaten as badly as Kay Parsons was. There was a bloody aluminum baseball bat lying beside Kay, and Edmonds was reasonably sure it had been used to bludgeon her. And then Edmonds also noticed there was a second weapon underneath the car, a bloody claw hammer. Seconds later, the ambulance finally arrived and Kay was rushed to the hospital. And as soon as she was gone, Edmonds led a room-by-room search of her house. And at first glance, it looked to Edmonds like Kay must have come home and interrupted a robbery in progress. The house was a complete mess upstairs and downstairs, as though someone had run through the entire house, searching every single drawer as quickly as possible. But the sheer brutality of the attack on Kay made Edmonds think this could be something else. I mean, what kind of burglar would suddenly begin bludgeoning someone to death with a hammer and bat just because they interrupted them? And so this just felt like a deeply personal crime to Edmonds, not just some random robbery. At some point during the room-by-room search, Edmonds stepped away and performed the grim duty of calling Kay's husband, David, to tell him what happened. Now, Edmonds didn't really go into any details over the phone. He just told David that he would need to fly home from Los Angeles immediately. David could tell obviously something terrible had happened, and by the time he hung up, David was reasonably sure that his wife had been badly injured. So he booked the first flight back to Georgia and rushed to the airport. Back at Kay's house, Edmonds knew he still had a second break-in to investigate, and he was afraid he would find another victim of a vicious attack. So Edmonds rounded up a few other deputies and walked next door to the Sears' home. The back door had been broken open just like over at Kay's house, and the contents of drawers in the Sears' home had been dumped all over the place just like in Kay's house. There were also smears of blood here and there, but not nearly as much as next door. The deputies combed the house from top to bottom, and luckily, they did not find another victim. Edmonds was searching the ransacked kitchen for potential evidence when Becky Sears, the mother, and her 19-year-old son, Chris, came into the backyard. Becky told Edmonds they had both been at work when her other son, Michael, had called to tell her about the break-in, so they'd rushed home as fast as they could. But Becky did not care at all about the fact that her house had been trashed and ransacked, because moments before Becky had walked into her house, a neighbor had told her that her good friend, Kay, had been taken away in an ambulance, and so all Becky wanted to know now from Edmonds was if Kay was okay. Edmonds was not really able to share any details about Kay, other than the fact that she had been alive when she was taken to the hospital. Within minutes, another neighbor appeared at the Sears' house and offered to give Becky and Chris a ride to the hospital to go check on Kay. And so Becky and Chris, they rushed out the door with that neighbor as fast as they had shown up, and Edmonds was suddenly left alone in the quiet kitchen, thinking about all these terrible things that had just unfolded in this small, seemingly safe suburban neighborhood. Edmonds figured Kay's house must have come first, and the person who broke in killed Kay, and then they must have come over to Becky's house next, but still had Kay's blood on their hands. And so that was why there was blood in both houses, despite there only being a victim in Kay's house. But that didn't make Edmonds feel much better. He now knew he was dealing with a criminal who was cool enough and cruel enough to beat this helpless woman until they were totally covered in her blood, and then casually just go next door, again covered in their blood, to rob another house. Edmonds wondered what kind of person could do something like that. Becky and some of Kay's other friends stood vigil in Kay's hospital waiting room all day long. They were desperate to get any word on Kay's condition. Every so often, Becky would ask one of the nurses if she could go in to see her friend, but they always said no, because the medical team was still trying to stabilize Kay. Eventually, another friend did make it to Kay's actual bedside, and she didn't even recognize the heavily bandaged person lying there. Kay's face was grotesquely swollen, and she was attached to all kinds of tubes and wires that were keeping her alive. The nurse wouldn't answer when the friend asked if Kay was brain dead. Finally, late in the afternoon, Kay's husband, David, arrived at the hospital straight from the airport. Sergeant Edmonds and other officers escorted David past Kay's friends to Kay's room, and they let him go in there all by himself. Seconds later, from beyond the double doors, Kay's friends heard David begin to sob. Kay had just died. Some of Kay's friends began to weep when they heard David crying, but Sergeant Edmonds had a different reaction to David. He wondered if David's loud display of grief was just a bit too much. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but Edmonds got the sense that David was just performing for an audience. While Edmonds was at the hospital, members of his investigative team had gone door to door all throughout Kay's neighborhood to try to get more information about what happened. But unfortunately, so far, they'd come up with nothing. Nobody in the neighborhood had heard or seen anything unusual between 7 and 8:30 a.m. that morning. So after Edmonds got back to the sheriff's department, he decided he would just bring in all of the people who had been at the crime scene one by one. And he started with Kay's handyman, Mitch. Once Mitch arrived at the station, Edmonds and Mitch would sit down across from each other in a small interview room. And Edmonds watched Mitch right away fight back tears as he recounted showing up at Kay's house and finding the smashed glass in the back door. Edmonds was initially skeptical of Mitch's story. After all, this guy had just happened to show up at the house right after Kay had been attacked. But Mitch would show Edmonds some emails that made it clear Kay really had been expecting him at her house at 8:30 a.m. that morning. And when Edmonds had searched Kay's house earlier, he hadn't seen any sign that Mitch ever went inside. So for the time, Edmonds decided Mitch was not a major suspect. But just when Edmonds was starting to think Mitch would have nothing useful to offer, Mitch began talking about the young man with black hair who was sitting on the other side of the street who had overheard his 911 call. The young man had told Mitch that his name was Michael and that he was Becky's oldest son. The mention of Michael made Edmonds' mind start racing. He had learned through his initial investigation that Becky's oldest son had a history of drug problems. The 22-year-old had once been a heroin addict. And Edmonds wanted to know why Michael was sitting across the street from Kay's house, which was now a murder scene, instead of in front of his own house, which had just been looted. Because remember, Michael didn't know what was going on in Kay's house until he overheard Mitch talk about Kay's house being robbed. And so Edmonds couldn't help but wonder if maybe Michael had tried to rob Kay's house to pay for his drug habit, but then Kay surprised him by coming home. She would have known Michael's face very well, and so maybe he decided to kill her so she wouldn't be able to identify him. Edmonds thanked Mitch for his help and ultimately let him go. Then he summoned Michael to the station. When Michael arrived, Edmonds led him into the small interrogation room, and the two sat down on opposite sides of a table. Michael was quiet and very polite, and as he sat there, he absently ran his hands through his dark black hair. Edmonds was very blunt, and he asked Michael if he was still using drugs. Michael admitted that he was. He said he was still fighting his heroin addiction, and in fact, that day, he had used methadone to try to curb his heroin cravings. Methadone is a medication that's often used to help people reduce or stop their use of heroin or other opiates. And so because Edmonds had wondered if Michael went to Kay's house to rob her to pay for drugs, Edmonds began to zero in on where Michael had been before the handyman, Mitch, had discovered the break-in at Kay's house. Michael stayed calm and polite. He claimed that his mother had dropped him off at 7 a.m. for a house painting job. But when Edmonds pressed Michael for details about this job, Michael's story fell apart. He couldn't say who he was working for or even where the job was. Now, Michael was starting to shift around in his seat uncomfortably. So Edmonds asked him again where he had been when Kay was attacked. Michael admitted he had been lying about the house painting job, but only because he didn't want his mother to know he was unemployed. He said he had really been watching TV at a friend's house. Edmonds was very annoyed that Michael had just lied to him, so he got up and walked out of the room. And Edmonds would keep Michael in that interrogation room for 3 more hours while he decided what to do with him. And in the end, Edmonds and his team, despite their suspicions, knew they really had no evidence linking Michael directly to this crime, so they couldn't just hold him indefinitely. But just before Edmonds was about to turn Michael loose, on a hunch, he asked Michael if he could look at the bottom of his sneakers. And when Michael showed him, Edmonds saw that wedged into one of the treads of one of his shoes was a gleaming shard of glass. When Edmonds asked Michael where the glass came from, Michael had no explanation. And so, as Michael walked out the door of the sheriff's office, he didn't know it, but he had just become Sergeant Edmonds' primary suspect. Not long after Michael left the sheriff's office, his 19-year-old brother, Chris, arrived for his interview. Chris was everything that Michael was not. He had a job, he had his own house, he had respectable friends, and he was so nervous when he sat down for his interview that Edmonds had to keep reassuring him that he was not actually in trouble yet. Chris said that he had gotten up that morning at about 7 a.m. He'd barely had enough time to brush his teeth before his mother, Becky, pulled up to his house. He had agreed to go work with Becky that day at the physical therapy clinic where she was the office manager. Chris was going to help out with several odd jobs around the building, but when his brother Michael had called about the break-in, Chris and his mom had left the clinic right away. Then, Edmonds got Chris talking about his brother Michael, and the conversation soon turned to Michael's drug habit. Chris confirmed that his brother was taking methadone again and struggling with his heroin addiction, and he was hanging with a very bad crowd. At this, Edmonds immediately grabbed a sheet of paper and a pen, and he asked Chris to tell him the names of the people Michael was spending his time with, who in theory might commit the kind of violent crime he was investigating. Chris looked at him and he said, "You might need a larger piece of paper." By midday on March 26th, so 24 hours after Kay had been discovered, Sergeant Edmonds was totally exhausted because basically he hadn't slept for the last 24 hours. But he knew he had a killer loose in his town, so he had no choice but to press on. And the more he found out, the more he suspected Kay's neighbor, Michael. First, Edmonds talked to the friend who Michael said he was with at the time of the murder. In a recorded conversation at the sheriff's office, Michael's friend emphatically said that he and Michael really had been watching TV together when Kay was attacked. But the friend offered to take a polygraph test right then and there, and he failed. Then, later in the afternoon, Edmonds called the owner of the physical therapy clinic where Kay's friend Becky worked, and the owner told Edmonds that Becky's son, Michael, had once stolen a company checkbook and written about $800 in bad checks before he was caught. The owner said he had agreed not to call the police after Becky had promised him that her son Michael would never step foot in the clinic again. But Edmonds still wondered whether the seemingly very laid-back and low-key Michael really had it in him to commit such a totally violent crime on this woman who seemed totally defenseless. But the evidence really was increasingly against Michael. The murder was looking more and more like a robbery gone wrong, either committed by Michael or one of his friends, and very likely just to get money for drugs. That evening, Michael and Chris's mother, Becky, was leaving work at the physical therapy clinic, and as she was walking down a dark walkway towards the parking lot, she thought she heard something in the bushes behind her. Becky turned around to see what the noise was, and she was totally startled to see a man wearing black clothes with a white baseball cap standing there in the bushes. Becky froze, and the man just started shouting at her that he wanted his money. Becky said she had no idea what he was talking about, but the man clearly was not playing around because he raised a gun and started waving it right in Becky's face. But Becky really didn't know anything about any money and so kept saying, I don't know. Finally, the man seemed to have enough and he lowered the gun from Becky's face to her left leg and he fired it right into her left shin. The bullet glanced off the bone and grazed Becky's right ankle. She felt a sharp pain rushing through both her legs and she collapsed to the ground. As Becky lay there, stunned and bleeding, staring up, waiting to get shot again, the man actually lowered the gun and said next time he was going to shoot her right in the face. Then the man just turned and ran off into the darkness. Becky, who was totally in shock and had no idea what was going on, still managed to grab her phone in her pocket and she called 911. After an ambulance arrived and took Becky to the hospital, sheriff's deputies searched the nearby woods for the shooter. They didn't find him, but all of them assumed one thing. This attack was not random. This shooting had to be connected to the break-ins on Hot Springs Drive and to Kay's murder. Becky was resting comfortably in her hospital bed when Sergeant Edmonds arrived to speak with her. Becky seemed perfectly fine to talk about what happened, and she would give Sergeant Edmonds a very detailed account of her attack. But when Edmonds asked her if there was any way her son Michael could have had something to do with this shooting, she was very quick to reject it. Edmonds speculated to Becky that perhaps her son Michael owed the shooter drug money, so the shooter was taking it out on Michael's mother. But Becky would respond by saying no, her son used to owe people money, but he didn't anymore. He didn't have debts anywhere. Edmonds could see this line of questioning was likely going nowhere, because Becky, despite her situation, seemed to be very set on protecting her kids, which makes sense, even if her son was guilty, she's gonna protect him. So Edmonds decided to try a new tactic. He asked Becky if she had any relationship troubles. Was there anyone in her personal circle who might want to hurt her? Becky didn't answer. She turned away from Edmonds and just kind of stared off into the distance. Then, without looking at him, she told him that she had a terrible secret that she had to get off her chest. Then, Becky told Edmonds she had cheated on her husband. She said her husband was a truck driver, which meant he was away a lot, and during his absences, she had turned to another man for comfort. But she insisted the affair was over and that she and her husband were working out their issues now. Edmonds had a lot more questions, but right at that moment, nurses began coming in and out of Becky's room to check on her. So for the time being, Edmonds just kind of let the topic slide without even finding out who this other man was who Becky had been romantically involved with. The next morning, March 27th, Edmonds was hoping that his third cup of coffee might finally wake him up. His investigation was only a few days in, but Edmonds had been going nonstop. Just then, Sergeant Edmonds' phone rang, and so he picked it up, and before he could even call out a greeting, the person who was calling him said they had information about Kay's murder that he needed to hear. Edmonds asked who the caller was, but they would only say they were close to Becky and her family. Then the caller said they knew who Becky was having an affair with. It was Kay's husband, David. The caller said the neighbors, Becky and David, had been having the affair for 6 months before the murder, writing love letters back and forth and hooking up all over town. Becky wanted both of them to leave their spouses so they could be together, but David was worried that he would lose custody of his son if he split from his wife. After the anonymous caller hung up, Edmonds desperately wanted to talk to Kay's husband, David, but he knew he would have to wait until after Kay's funeral, which was that afternoon. At Kay's funeral, David was surrounded by loving supporters who had no idea that he had been cheating on his murdered wife. But one of Kay's closest friends couldn't shake the feeling that David was acting strangely for a man at his wife's funeral. When she had given David a hug, he told her that he was sorry and that he never wanted this to happen. The friend didn't understand what that meant, but she didn't think it was the right time to ask. At the end of the service, David, Becky, and all of Kay's loved ones looked on with sorrowful expressions as 6 pallbearers carried Kay's casket out of the church. Then the pallbearers put the casket into a hearse for the trip to the cemetery. David walked with his son to a waiting car that would follow the hearse, but Sergeant Edmonds approached and stopped them. Edmonds took David by the arm and quietly told him that they needed to talk right away. He said he understood that the family was obviously grieving, but really this couldn't wait. Edmonds asked David to come to the station right after Kay was interred. That evening, David looked emotionally raw and weary when he sat down across from Edmonds in the small interrogation room at the sheriff's station. Edmonds then told David point blank that he was in serious trouble and that he would not be doing his son or his family any good if he lied right now to the police and ended up going to jail. David seemed to know what this was about, and he nodded in agreement. Then Edmonds asked him about the affair with Becky, and David definitely saw this coming because right away he just began confessing. David said his affair with Becky had started about 6 months earlier when she had flirted with him on the tennis court. They had been playing doubles against Becky's husband and Kay when Becky had made a bad shot. She had leaned in close and said to David that she was playing badly because he was distracting her. Not long after that, the two began meeting at his house, her mother's house, or in their cars like it was some kind of high school romance. David said that he and Becky had pledged their love for each other, but he was just not ready to upset his own marriage. He worried that if he got divorced, Kay would take their son far away from him and prevent him from seeing him. So David and Becky's affair remained secret. But then David said he had broken things off with Becky a month before Kay's murder. David had told Becky they couldn't be together, at least until his 12-year-old son had graduated from college. David said that Becky was devastated, but she had accepted his decision and decided instead to focus on her own relationship with her husband. And Becky really had begun working on that relationship with a bracing dose of honesty. She admitted to her husband that she had been having an affair with their neighbor, David, and her husband did not take it well. He was shocked and furious, and he immediately called Kay to ask if she knew that her husband, David, was having an affair with his wife, Becky. Kay was totally caught off guard and said she absolutely did not know that. After that, David had had no choice but to confess to Kay about the affair and then beg for Kay's forgiveness. And to his surprise, Kay had accepted his apology and said they would work through their crisis together. But Kay had said she would not have her family living next door to Becky any longer. She wanted to sell the house immediately. Kay had also quit her job where she and Becky worked together, and she vowed never to speak to her former friend again. David said he was done speaking to Becky too, and that he was ready to make a fresh start. When David finished talking, Edmonds just stared at him for a second and then looked down at his notes. Edmonds had all of David's cell phone records, and he knew that David had continued talking to Becky after their supposed breakup, including a call that lasted nearly 2 hours on the night before Kay's murder. And when Edmonds brought this up to David, that clearly David had just lied to him about his real relationship with Becky, David's face turned beet red, but he pressed ahead again. He admitted he had spoken to Becky numerous times after the breakup, but it was just to see how she was holding up. But on the night before Kay's murder, when David was in Los Angeles on business, he admitted that that long conversation he had had with Becky had turned sexual. And on that call, they had both admitted that they still had strong feelings for each other. Edmonds said that could explain the call David made the night before the murder, but David had also called Becky right around the time Kay was bludgeoned to death, so Edmonds wanted to know what that call was about. David said he had only talked to Becky on the morning of the murder because at the time he'd been worried about his wife. Kay hadn't picked up when he had called her, so kind of out of desperation, he had just called Becky to see if maybe she had heard anything about Kay. Edmonds didn't say anything back to David, but inside, he wondered if the real reason David had called right at that time was to find out if his wife had been murdered yet. David seemed to know exactly what Sergeant Edmonds was thinking, so David quickly denied having anything to do with Kay's death. He said the last thing he would ever want to do was take his son's mother away from him. Before David could say anything else, Edmonds cut him off and said, desperate people do desperate things. At this, David just kind of hunched over and fell silent. It was now dark outside, and the interview had gone on for 3.5 hours. Edmonds stood up, stretched, excused himself, and walked out of the room. Then, once he was outside the room, he watched from the other side of the one-way glass as David started to cry. And as he cried, all they could hear David saying to himself was, "Everyone is going to blame me." Edmonds knew David had been in Los Angeles at the time of Kay's murder. But after this meeting with David, he thought David could have been involved in some way. After all, David's wife was murdered, and the woman he'd been having an affair with was in the hospital from a gunshot wound. Later that evening, Edmonds was at his desk when he received a very strange call from an inmate at the county jail. The inmate said he knew who killed Kay Parsons. Edmonds asked why he should trust a guy who was in jail at the time when Kay had died, so how could he possibly know the truth? And the inmate just said Edmonds really needed to trust him because before he ended up in jail, Kay's killer had asked him to help with this murder. Edmonds was reasonably convinced that this guy had real information, but the inmate made it clear to Edmonds that he wanted to give him the information in person. So Edmonds hung up and he immediately headed to the jail. And Edmonds was waiting inside of an interview room when guards escorted in a middle-aged man dressed in pink jail sweats and flip-flops. The inmate did not hold anything back when he spoke to Edmonds, and by the time Edmonds left the county jail, he had multiple new leads to follow up on. And within days, those leads would pay off, and the police would finally figure out who had killed Kay. Based on information provided by that inmate, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Kay Parsons on the morning of March 25th, 2009. At around 7:15 a.m., the killer saw Kay's car driving down the street towards her house. So the killer quickly darted around to the back of Kay's house to those French doors. The killer had a claw hammer in their hand, and so after looking around to make sure nobody could see them, they raised that hammer and then smashed in one of the glass panes on the French doors. Then the killer reached in through the opening, unlocked the door, and stepped inside of Kay's kitchen. Now, at the same time this was happening, Kay actually was entering the home through the front door. And so the killer figured Kay must have heard the glass shattering. So the killer just kind of clutched their hammer tight and waited to see what Kay would do. A few seconds later, Kay walked into the kitchen to see what was going on, and she saw a person standing there carrying a hammer, and so naturally she began to scream. Before Kay could turn and run though, the killer leapt at her and swung the hammer wildly. Kay immediately threw her arms up to protect her head and her face, but the killer just kept beating her arms with the hammer over and over again until she lowered them, at which point the killer began smashing Kay in the head and the torso, and blood began spraying everywhere. Kay stumbled backwards out of the kitchen, barely conscious, but somehow she managed to turn and actually run away from her killer. The killer was totally shocked that at this point Kay was still on her feet. And so for a second, the killer just stood there watching as Kay kind of stumbled down the hallway. But when Kay actually reached the door that led into the garage, the killer kind of realized what they needed to do, and they chased after Kay. And so Kay, she gets that door open, and she manages to walk into the garage, but by this point, she had lost so much blood, she was so badly beaten, that she just fell to the ground right by her parked car. The killer rushed into the garage after her, and then stood over Kay and raised the hammer, but the hammer was so slick from all the blood on it that when they tried to bring it down, it slipped out of their hand and slid under Kay's car. In a panic, the killer looked around the garage for another weapon to finish Kay off, and their eyes fell on the aluminum bat propped up against the wall. The killer lunged for the bat and then came back over to Kay, and they stood there bludgeoning her over and over and over again until she wasn't moving. The killer, the garage, and Kay were now all covered in blood. And the killer was reasonably sure that at this point, Kay was dead. They had no idea she actually still had a pulse. The killer dropped the bat and ran back into the house. They trashed every room inside, throwing things on the ground and doing whatever they could to make it look like this was a robbery. Then, feeling satisfied, the killer crept out through the open French door, stepping on broken glass as they left. Once they were outside, the killer glanced back and forth to make sure nobody had seen them. Then they ran right next door into Becky's house and ransacked that place too. But then, after they were done, instead of leaving, the killer stripped off their bloody clothes and found a fresh set of clothes in that house to change into, and then they grabbed their phone and called their mother. It would turn out Becky's heroin addict son, Michael, who everybody assumed was involved in some way with this murder, had nothing to do with it. Becky's other son, Chris, the so-called good son, he had been the one who murdered Kay. Chris had always been Becky's favorite child, and he would do anything to make his mom happy. Becky had told Chris things about her life that she would never tell her other son, Michael. So Chris was aware of the fact that his mom was having an affair with their neighbor, David, and that she believed David was actually still in love with her. And so Chris also came to believe that his neighbor, Kay, was actually standing in the way of his mother's happiness. In fact, Becky had even said to Chris that she wanted Kay dead. And all of this information began to come to light when Sergeant Edmonds met with the inmate who had called him. It turned out the inmate was Becky's own brother, and he told Sergeant Edmonds that Becky had asked him if he knew anyone who could kill Kay and make it look like an accident. At first, he had thought she was joking, but after Becky kept pressing him, he knew she was serious. So when he learned that Kay really had been killed, he was sure his sister had something to do with it. And so that's why he reached out to Sergeant Edmonds. Now, after hearing this from the inmate, Edmonds still believed that Michael had to be involved, that maybe Becky had asked him to carry out the murder. But when Edmonds questioned Michael again, it was clear the young man had no idea about his mother's affair. So Edmonds went back to the hospital to meet with Becky, who was still recovering from her gunshot wounds. Edmonds interrogated Becky, and she finally cracked. She admitted that she had told her other son Chris all about the affair and about how much she hated Kay, but Becky didn't stop there. She told Edmonds that she had asked Chris to confront Kay on her behalf on the morning of the murder, but she said she didn't think her son would do anything violent. But after Chris had just killed Kay and then came back to his own house and staged another break-in and changed out of his bloody clothes, he had called his mother and told her he had just murdered Kay. She had driven to the house, picked Chris up, and gone with him to dispose of his bloody clothes, and then when they came back to the house, because her other son Michael had called her saying, "Oh my goodness, our house has been broken into," when she and Chris came back, all the police were there, and she would tell the police right away that she and Chris had been working at the clinic all that morning. And then after that, Becky and Chris had staged the shooting outside of Becky's work. Chris was the shooter who had leapt out of the bushes. Becky hoped the shooting would remove suspicion from her and her family and allow Chris to get away with Kay's murder. Even after admitting all of that, Becky still insisted that she had nothing to do with Kay's death. She told Edmonds that she had just totally messed up when she had given her son, Chris, the impression that she really wanted him to go do something horrible to Kay. But police and prosecutors did not believe that Becky was as innocent as she let on, and so both she and her son Chris were arrested. In the end, Becky and Chris pleaded guilty to the murder of Kay Parsons in order to avoid the death penalty. Both are now serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Run Fool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, but in video format on our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On April 18, 1992, a person in California turned their shower on and waited until the steam was rising up out of the stall before they stepped inside. Once under the water, this person grabbed a can of shaving cream and applied it to their entire body. And slowly, they began shaving off every hair on their body except for the hair on their head. After they were done, they hopped out of the shower, they toweled off, got dressed, and then began the next phase of their prep, packing their backpack with things like latex gloves and plastic sheets. After they were done, they climbed into bed and set their alarm for very early the next morning. They were nervous about what was going to happen the next day, but they were confident that they were ready. 24 hours later, and what this hairless person had done was all over the news. But before we get into that story, I want to tell you about my absolute favorite storytelling show. It's called Bedtime Stories, and it's truly one of the most entertaining and mind-bending, terrifying shows I have ever heard, and they have a truly incredible storyteller. And here's a bit of exclusive news. It's been handpicked by me to become our very first non-Mr. Ballen hosted podcast under the Ballen Studios banner. And the show is live right now with the first 3 episodes. You can listen to Bedtime Stories right here on Amazon Music. So, if that's of interest to you, right before the Amazon review button lays down to go to bed, put on my new favorite show, Bedtime Stories, and scare the absolute crap out of it. Okay, let's get into today's story. On Friday, April 17th, 1993, 59-year-old millionaire Dale Ewell was flying his Beechcraft Bonanza single-engine airplane thousands of feet above Fresno, California. Dale was a handsome man with blue eyes and dark hair that was starting to turn gray. He was flying his plane from where he lived in Fresno to a small airport about 45 minutes away because he was going to meet his wife and kids at the family's beach house for Easter weekend. In the cockpit, Dale looked out at the clear blue sky and listened to the hum of the plane's engine, and suddenly any stress he might have been dealing with just kind of disappeared. Airplanes had been a huge part of Dale's life for almost 40 years, and he never felt better than when he was flying. In the 1950s, Dale had flown twin-engine turboprop planes as a member of the United States Air Force, and then after he left the military, Dale had gotten a job selling small airplanes to private pilots and California ranchers for a company owned by a man named Frank Lamb. Frank had taken Dale under his wing and taught him everything he could about the airplane industry, and Dale had turned out to be a very gifted airplane salesman. Part of Dale's skill as a salesman was that he was very charming, and he felt comfortable talking to all kinds of people, but really the main reason Dale had been so successful at selling planes was because his love of being a pilot really rubbed off on people. And when he talked to potential clients about the peace and the awe he felt when he was flying, they wanted to experience the same thing. And so Dale had quickly moved up the company ladder, and when Frank had stepped away from the business 20 years earlier, Dale had taken over and become the owner and president of the company. Once Dale was in charge, he had started making a lot of money, and he invested that money really well. So in 1992, as Dale approached his 60th birthday, he was worth about $8 million, which would be over $17 million in 2023. When Dale got to be about 20 miles away from the airport where he was going, he radioed air traffic control and got clearance to make his final approach. Dale descended to an altitude of about 2,000 feet and then started the landing procedure. And when he touched down on the runway, he was already looking forward to flying again in a couple of days. But first, he was eager to spend some time relaxing with his family. Dale got into a car that he had arranged to have waiting for him at the airport, and then he drove a few miles to Pajaro Dunes, a small upscale beachfront community in Northern California. He made his way down a secluded street, past large homes that looked out onto the Pacific Ocean, and then finally he pulled up to his own beach house, he parked his car, and stepped outside. His wife, Glee, and his daughter, Tiffany, were sitting on the porch waiting for him. Glee and Tiffany had driven to the beach house together the day before. Glee, who had short brown hair and a big smile, stood up and kissed her husband when he stepped onto the porch. Glee and Dale had been married for 31 years, and when they had started making a lot of money, Glee had really committed herself to community service and philanthropy. And so as a result, back in Fresno where they lived, Glee was admired as a community leader. But Glee had a past that most people in Fresno didn't know anything about. She was extremely smart and she had a talent for speaking foreign languages. And in the late 1950s, before she and Dale had gotten married, Glee's skills had landed her a job in South America as a translator for the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, which is a federal agency in the United States that specializes in foreign intelligence. Glee's children thought it was exciting that their mom had once worked for the CIA, but Glee thought about her time in South America like it was from a different life. On the porch, Glee and Dale's daughter, Tiffany, got up and hugged her dad. Then she opened the door, and they all went inside the beach house. Tiffany was 24 years old, with cropped blonde hair and a smile that was almost identical to her mother's. She was quiet and reserved around people she didn't know, and in fact, she'd been named the shyest person in class when she was in college. But Tiffany's family and her few close friends knew she was funny and sweet and a great person to talk to once she'd let her guard down. So Dale, Glee, and Tiffany spent a lot of that day just talking to each other, and their main topic of conversation was the youngest member of the family, Dana, and his new girlfriend, Monica Zent. The two had met at their dorm at Santa Clara University, which was a little over an hour from the beach house. And the next day, Dana was supposed to bring Monica out to the beach house to meet the rest of his family. The following morning, 20-year-old Dana Ewell pulled up to the front of the beach house in his gold Mercedes-Benz, and he, along with his girlfriend, Monica, got out of the car and walked towards the front door. Dana was tall and thin with dark brown hair, and this day he wore a t-shirt and jeans, but that outfit was actually kind of unusual for him. Most of the time, when Dana went anywhere, even to his college classes, he wore a tailored Armani suit, which is very fancy. Dana looked up to his father, and he really wanted to be successful like his dad was, and so he thought it was important to dress the part. Dana and Monica walked inside the beach house, and Dana right away called out for his parents. Monica looked around the large front room and listened to the sound of the ocean just outside, and she was kind of in shock. Monica's father was an FBI agent, so she had not grown up around people who had as much money as Dana and his family. So the gold Mercedes, the beachfront property, the airplanes, and the whole lifestyle the Ewells led was just all so new to her. Dale, Glee, and Tiffany came into the front room from the kitchen and said hello to Dana and Monica. Then Glee asked Monica to go on a tour of the beach house, really just so Glee could get to know her son's new girlfriend a little bit better. And later that day, while Monica was spending time with Glee and also with Tiffany, Dana and Dale went to play tennis on a court that was reserved just for residents of this small beach community. As they played, Dale talked to his son about the airplane business, but he really wanted to hear about how Dana was doing at school. Dana said classes were going great and that he really liked his girlfriend Monica, so he was excited that the family was finally getting to meet her. Dana also said that he really hoped the entire family would get to spend more time together as a whole once this semester was over. And then the two of them started talking about their favorite topic, flying. Dana said that he wanted to get into piloting helicopters, so his dad, Dale, said they should find a good place for him to take lessons that was not too far from school. They played tennis for a bit longer, and then they headed back to the beach house. Later that night, a few hours after dinner, Dale and his wife Glee were lying in bed, and they began talking about how lucky they were to have this beach house, this really nice place where the whole family could go and spend time together and just kind of be away from everything for a little while. Glee said that she knew the kids were growing up and they had their own lives and interests, but she just hoped that Dana and Tiffany would keep coming to the beach house even when they were older and had families of their own. On April 19th, the following day, Dale helped his wife and his daughter load up Glee's gray Cadillac with the suitcases and cooler of food that they had brought to the beach. Dana and Monica were going to have Easter dinner with Monica's parents, so they had already left. Once Glee's car was loaded, Dale gave his wife and his daughter a kiss and told them he'd see them when he got home. Then Dale got into his own car and drove to the airport so he could fly his plane back to Fresno. Tiffany climbed into the passenger seat of the Cadillac, and Glee got behind the wheel, and then a couple of minutes later, they began their drive back home. It would take them 3 hours to complete the drive, but they made a pit stop about halfway through and grabbed some food at a fast food restaurant called Foster's Freeze, which was Tiffany's favorite place to get a milkshake. Finally, at about 5 p.m., Glee and Tiffany pulled into the driveway of their large ranch-style house in a secluded, wealthy neighborhood in Fresno. The house had a sprawling front yard that was beautifully landscaped with huge trees and a stone fountain in the center of the yard. Glee opened the garage door and pulled the Cadillac inside. Dale's car wasn't there, but that didn't surprise her. Even though the flight Dale had made was short, Glee knew he would spend some time at the airport making sure everything was all right with his plane. Tiffany got out of the car. She was carrying her drink from Foster's Freeze. Glee went around to the back seat, grabbed the cooler, and then followed Tiffany into their house. Once they were inside, Glee stopped to put the cooler down, but Tiffany kept on walking, and she disappeared down a hallway that led to the kitchen. Then, Glee thought that she heard something fall onto the floor down the hall, so she called out to Tiffany, but Tiffany didn't call back. So Glee walked into the hallway where Tiffany had just been, and when she did, she screamed, turned around, and started running. That night, Dana sat at the dinner table with his girlfriend Monica and her parents at Monica's parents' house. They had just finished a large Easter dinner, and Dana thanked Monica's parents for letting him spend the holiday with them. Then, not long after that, Dana and Monica drove back to their college campus in Dana's car. When they got to Dana's dorm room, he called home, but nobody answered. Dana thought it was odd that they were not picking up because he figured by now his family would be back from the beach, but Monica told him that they might have gone out for Easter dinner, or maybe they had all been worn out from the trip and just went straight to bed. But the following afternoon, Dana called home again after his classes, and there still was not any answer. So Dana called his father's office. and his father's assistant said that Dale had not checked in with her that day, but she thought it was possible that maybe Dale was just taking another day off after Easter. Dana said it seemed really strange to him that his dad had not even called the office to let her know. Dana finally hung up the phone, and then he went to find Monica in her dorm room. And as soon as Monica saw him, she knew something was wrong. Dana was pacing back and forth, and he had a really worried look on his face. Monica asked what was going on, and he told her that he still couldn't get a hold of his parents or his sister. Monica stood up and walked over to him and put her hands on his shoulders and tried to get him to calm down. And she said if he was really worried, he could totally call her dad because he was an FBI agent and he would know what to do. Dana said he really was worried, so Monica did call her father and then handed the phone over to Dana. Dana thanked Monica's dad for talking with him, and then he told him what was going on with his family. And Monica's dad pretty much immediately urged Dana to just stay calm, and then he also told Dana that, he would be happy to look around on his end to see if he could learn anything about what was going on with them. Later that day, Monica's dad would call Dana back, and even though he didn't have much information, what he did know was the Ewell's home security alarm company had not gotten any indication that the alarm had gone off or that anything out of the ordinary had occurred at the house. After hearing this, Dana did feel a bit more relaxed, and Monica would say to him that, probably he just missed his family at the house when he had called. Dana figured she was right, and he told her that he would just try to get a hold of them in the morning if they still had not contacted him by then. The next day at 9 a.m., so this was April 21st, 2 days after Glee and her daughter Tiffany had gotten back to their home in Fresno, the Ewell's housekeeper walked up to their front door, unlocked it with a key that she had, and she went inside. She was surprised that the alarm didn't beep when she walked in. The family was usually gone when she was there, and they almost always set the alarm when they left. So the housekeeper called out for Glee to see if she was home, but nobody responded. Then the housekeeper walked through the foyer into the living room that had high vaulted ceilings, and she got scared. Cushions from the couch were on the floor, and pictures had been pulled off the wall. The housekeeper called out to Glee again, but still nobody responded. And so the housekeeper took a breath and tried to calm her nerves, but when she walked into the hallway that led to the kitchen, she immediately screamed and ran back through the house out the front door, and when she got out there, she just happened to see a man walking towards her, and she began screaming out at him. The man tried to figure out what was going on. He would say that he was the Ewell's neighbor, and that their son, Dana, had called him that morning because Dana was worried about his parents. The housekeeper just shook her head, started to cry, and pointed to the Ewell's front door. The neighbor would go inside, and he would see the house was a total mess. Then he too stepped into the hallway, and immediately he ran to the phone and dialed 911. A few minutes after that 911 call, the sound of police sirens cut through the quiet morning in the Ewell's wealthy Fresno neighborhood. Lead investigator John Souza of the Fresno County Sheriff's Department parked his car in front of the Ewell's house and stepped outside. It was a warm spring day, about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Souza was short with dark hair and a thick mustache, and it was bright out, so he had his sunglasses on. From behind his glasses, he could see that the police sirens had already attracted a crowd. People up and down the street were now standing on their lawns, just staring over at the Ewell's house, wondering what was going on. Detective Souza saw the Ewell's housekeeper and their neighbor, who had called 911, standing outside. The housekeeper was inconsolable, and the neighbor looked like he was still in shock. So Souza walked up to them and tried to calm them down and told them everything was okay now, and then at some point the neighbor told Souza what he had seen inside of the Ewell's house. Another squad car pulled up, and Deputy Chris Curtis got out. He was young and tall with light brown hair. Souza asked the neighbor and the housekeeper to please wait outside, and he told them that other officers would arrive soon to ask them more questions. Then Souza took off his sunglasses and waved Deputy Curtis over to him, and then the two of them walked into the Ewell's house together. Every room Souza and Curtis walked through inside of the house looked like it had been totally ransacked. Souza had spent his early days in law enforcement in the robbery unit, and he told Curtis that in all his time investigating robberies, he'd never seen a house in this state. It was like whoever had done this had opened and emptied virtually every cabinet and drawer and littered the floor with everything the Ewells owned. Then Souza and Curtis walked down the hall towards the kitchen, and they found the first body. Dale was lying face down, dead in the hallway. A pool of dried blood had formed under his face, and several unopened newspapers were scattered across the floor. Souza thought it looked like rigor mortis had already started to set in on the body. Rigor mortis is when muscles in a body stiffen after death. And so Souza wondered if Dale had been dead for days. Souza and Curtis walked further down the hall, they came to the kitchen, and they stopped again, because on the kitchen floor, they saw Tiffany lying face down like her father. Blood had run across the kitchen floor, and a drink had spilled nearby. Then they went back into the hall, walked into a home office, and found the third body. Glee was lying on her side, and massive amounts of blood had pooled behind her. Not long after Souza and Curtis found Glee, the forensics team arrived and started looking for evidence on and around the bodies. And while they did that, Souza and Curtis searched the rest of the house. The door to the main bedroom was open, and Souza could see that the bedroom looked even more torn apart than the rest of the house. He and Curtis walked into the room and saw that every drawer of a large wooden dresser had been opened and clothes were all over the floor. Souza walked over to a vanity table and saw an open jewelry box that had been emptied. It seemed clear that whoever had killed the Ewells had also stolen valuable items from this jewelry box. So Souza thought there was a chance this was just a robbery gone wrong, that the Ewells had just come home at the worst time, and when they walked in on the robbers panicked and killed them all. After doing an initial search of the house, Souza and Curtis joined the forensics team near Dale's body. Forensics officers had found Dale's wallet nearby, but it had been cleaned out, and that supported the idea that robbery could have been the motive behind these killings. But then, forensics officers told Souza something that he was not expecting to hear. Based on the wounds on the bodies, they believed the Ewells had been shot with a semi-automatic 9mm pistol. But there was no murder weapon, and not a single bullet casing had been left behind. And they said the weapon used, and the way in which the victims were killed, was like something they had seen in professional hits carried out by drug cartels. They also told Souza that they found small yellow fibers on all three bodies, but they'd have to run tests on these fibers to know what they were. Souza didn't know what to make of any of that. On the surface, nothing about the Ewells led him to believe they were mixed up in drug smuggling or some criminal enterprise. But Souza knew enough not to rule anything out. So, as more members of his investigative team arrived, Souza sent them out to interview the Ewells' neighbors. Then, Souza got word from his boss that Dana Ewell was on his way to the sheriff's station with an FBI agent, and Souza needed to go see them. At around noon, so 3 hours after the bodies had been discovered, Dana sat with his girlfriend Monica and her father, the FBI agent, in a small office in the Fresno County Sheriff's Department. Dana had called his parents' neighbor to ask him to check on the house. After the neighbor found the bodies and called 911, he had called Dana back and told Dana he needed to come home right now. But when Dana asked what was going on, the neighbor just kept saying over and over that he just needed to come home. Right after that, Dana had found Monica, and they called Monica's dad, the FBI agent. Dana said he knew something had to be really wrong, even if the neighbor wouldn't say what it was. And so using his law enforcement contacts, Monica's dad found out what had happened, and he had called ahead to the Fresno Sheriff's Department to let them know that he and Dana would be there soon. Then Dana, Monica, and her dad had flown to Fresno and headed right to the Sheriff's Department. In the office, Monica held Dana's hand tight. Dana hadn't heard all of the details, but he knew his parents and his sister were dead. Detective Souza and Deputy Curtis walked into the office, fresh from the crime scene. Souza told Dana right away how sorry he was about what had happened. In a quiet voice, Dana asked if there was anything he could do to help. And Souza said, well, I know your father was a wealthy businessman. Do you know if maybe he had any enemies in the corporate world? Dana looked up in surprise, and then looked at his girlfriend, and then over at her father, and then he looked up at Souza and said as far as he knew, his dad did not have any enemies. They talked a while longer, and anytime Dana had questions about the investigation process, he would look to Monica's dad for help. Monica's dad and Souza both explained that it could take a while to figure out exactly what had happened. So Dana said he would stay with his uncle, who lived close by, in case the police needed anything else from him. Souza thanked them all for coming in and said he'd be in touch soon. But the following day, Dana would reach out to Souza and he would tell him that he really needed to speak to the police again. And when Sousa and Dana met for the second time in that same small office at the sheriff's department, Dana said he had not been completely honest the day before because he did not want to upset his girlfriend or his girlfriend's father. Sousa was a little thrown off by this, but he said he understood, and then he asked Dana to tell him anything that might help police in their investigation. Dana told Sousa that his father, Dale, did have one enemy that he was aware of, and his name was Frank Lamb, the man who had mentored his father and who had owned the airplane business before handing it over to Dale. Detective Sousa thanked Dana for coming back in and for being honest with him. And later that day, Sousa discovered that Frank Lamb had not just walked away from his company in the 1970s and sold it to Dale. It turned out Frank had been busted in a federal drug trafficking case, and when he got sent to prison for 3 years, Dale had swooped in and taken the company out from under him. A few days after the murder, Sousa and Curtis went to meet Frank at his house. Frank, who was very soft-spoken and polite, quickly welcomed the investigators inside. Frank said he'd read about the deaths of Dale and his family, and regardless of whatever bad blood had existed between them, Frank was sad to hear about what had happened. Sousa and Curtis pressed Frank about his connection to known drug smugglers that had landed him in prison back in the 1970s. Frank said he had no connection to any drug runners and that he had nothing to do with Dale's murder. Then he smiled at Sousa and said, Dale was very selfish and a very hard guy to work with, so I wouldn't be surprised if Dale had made a lot of people angry over his career. Sousa and Curtis left Frank's house with not much more to go on than what they had arrived with. Sousa didn't necessarily trust Frank, but the idea that Frank had waited 20 years to exact some kind of revenge on Dale didn't seem right to Sousa. Still, there were details at the crime scene that made it look like the murders could have been carried out by a hitman from a drug cartel. So Sousa didn't want to totally dismiss Frank as a suspect. But later that week, Sousa and Curtis made a discovery that seemed even more bizarre than the idea that the Ewells were connected to a drug smuggling operation. They found out that Glee had once worked for the CIA. Sousa reached out to the CIA, but the CIA was not forthcoming with many details. All Sousa learned was that Glee had been a Spanish translator in South America for the CIA over 30 years earlier. So all of a sudden, Sousa and his team wondered if Glee had been the target, and if the murders were somehow retribution for something she'd been involved in during her time in the agency. And that information about Glee's past somehow got out, and the media jumped all over it. Pretty soon, there were tabloid-style stories about the murdered millionaires with possible connections to international drug cartels and the CIA. With all this media attention, the spotlight got even brighter on the Fresno Sheriff's Department, and Dana and other members of the Ewell family and some friends started to publicly question if Sousa and his team were really up to the task here. Dana got so frustrated with the lack of progress and the crazy rumors swirling around about his family that he publicly compared Sousa and Curtis to Bert and Ernie from Sesame Street, the kids show. Dana thought these two would never find the person who had killed his parents and his sister. Sousa and his team tried to block out the noise and just stay focused on their investigation. And as they continued to turn over all the evidence in front of them, they realized that despite the possible links to drug cartels and the CIA, Sousa came to believe that the case might be a lot simpler than that. The Ewells were rich, and their house had been ransacked. But all the families in their neighborhood were rich too, and no other homes had been hit. So Sousa wanted to focus on people who would have known how wealthy the Ewells were and who had a direct connection to them. But when Sousa and his team shifted their investigation in this direction, it became clear that anyone who went to school with Dana would have known about his family's money. Because not only did Dana walk around campus in expensive Armani suits, but his college newspaper had also done a story about him. And in that story, Dana had talked a lot about the success of his father's business and his family's wealth. So Sousa and his team reached out to some of Dana's friends at Santa Clara University, and a few of them said there was one person who police really needed to talk to, a recent graduate named Joel Radovich. They all said Joel was a loner and kind of a strange guy, and that he had always seemed a little obsessed with Dana. On May 8th, almost 3 weeks after the murders, Sousa drove 2.5 hours from Fresno to Santa Clara to meet Joel Radovich. And when Sousa had talked to Joel on the phone to arrange this meeting, he just got an odd feeling about him. Joel said he did not want police to come to his mother's house, so he would go to the motel where Sousa was going to be staying. But that wasn't really what had grabbed Sousa's attention. Before Sousa had hung up, Joel asked him if he was going to be arrested. Sousa had told Joel that, "No, I really just want to talk to you," but Sousa did think it was very odd that someone would jump to the conclusion that they were being arrested right off the bat. Outside the motel, Sousa saw Joel pull into the parking lot in his black Honda CRX car. Joel got out of the car and began walking over to Sousa. Joel was 22 years old with bleached blonde hair. He wore a baggy long-sleeve shirt and baggy jeans. Sousa introduced himself and then led Joel to a small motel room, and then they both sat down at a table that was pushed up against the wall. And before Sousa could even ask a question, Joel asked again if he was going to be arrested. A look of surprise came across Sousa's face, and he asked why Joel was so worried about that. Joel said that he'd actually been arrested years earlier for stealing furniture from a dorm at Santa Clara University, and since then, he said the Santa Clara police were always harassing him. Sousa told Joel that he didn't have anything to do with the Santa Clara police or the stolen furniture, but Sousa made a note that Joel had just admitted to having committed a robbery in the past. Sousa asked Joel how he knew Dana. Joel said they had met in the dorm and hung out a few times, but that was really it. Joel was a couple of years ahead of Dana in college, so they weren't really close, and Joel said he had not kept in touch with Dana, or really anybody from school, since he had graduated a year earlier. Then Sousa asked Joel where he had been on Easter Sunday. Joel immediately looked up at the ceiling like he was trying to remember something, and then he looked down and he said that he'd actually been at a paint and body shop getting some work done on his car. After chatting for a bit longer, Sousa finally smiled and thanked Joel for driving all this way out to the motel to meet him, and then Joel got up and walked out of the motel. But right after Joel was gone, Sousa got in touch with members of his team. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he thought Joel was hiding something. He wasn't sure the kid was a killer, but he was almost positive Joel knew more than he was saying. So Sousa wanted to learn as much about him as he could. It would take months for the sheriff's department to get everything in place, but eventually they got clearance to conduct full-time surveillance on Joel. And what police learned from that surveillance operation and from digging deeper into Joel's life convinced Sousa the investigation was on the right track. But Sousa's process was methodical and slow, and months went by without any new information getting out to the public. So Dana and other people on the outside thought the cops just weren't doing anything. And as the investigation stretched into months and then years, even Monica's dad, the FBI agent, questioned the Fresno Sheriff's Department's techniques. But Sousa, Curtis, and the rest of the team just kept blocking out the public attacks. They were confident they had the killer in their sights, but they wanted to make sure their case was airtight before they moved in. In early March of 1995, almost 3 years after the murders, Sousa, Curtis, and local police officers approached a TGI Fridays restaurant in a town just outside of Los Angeles. Sousa went around back to where he had a car waiting, and Curtis and the others headed inside. The music was loud inside, and the place was packed, and Curtis was surprised this was where the investigation had finally led. But he and Sousa were sure that the bartender working at Fridays that night was the one person who could bring the Yule murder case to a close. Curtis weaved around a few tables and moved out of the way of the server, but he never took his eyes off the bartender. And the bartender eventually looked up and saw Curtis coming his way. The bartender immediately began scanning around the room like he was looking for his exit, but he could tell there was just no way he could make a run for it. So Curtis and the other cops walked up to the bartender and told him they needed to talk. The bartender got a look on his face like he knew he'd been caught. Then police led him out through the kitchen to a parking lot behind the restaurant, and they put him in the car where Sousa was waiting for him. And when Sousa was done talking to this bartender, police would finally know who had killed Dale, Glee, and Tiffany, and how they had done it. Based on information provided by the bartender, evidence found at the murder scene, and details from interviews carried out during the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened the day someone murdered the Ewell family on April 19th, 1992. On the night of April 18th, so the day before the murders, the killer watched steam rise from their shower. While the hot water ran, the killer stepped into the shower and covered their body in shaving cream. Then they reached down with their right hand, grabbed a disposable razor from the side of the shower, and ran the blade over the hair on their left forearm. A few minutes later, they rinsed the razor off under the hot water, they bent down, and started shaving the hair on their left leg. The process took a long time, but eventually the killer had removed all of their body hair except for their eyebrows and the hair on their head. After they were done, they stepped out of the shower and dried off. Before sunrise on April 19th, the following morning, the killer got dressed in all black, wore a knit hat to cover the hair on their head, and slipped on a pair of latex gloves. The killer walked outside and put a large backpack as well as an unloaded semi-automatic 9mm gun in the back seat of the car. Then the killer drove to the Ewells neighborhood. When they arrived, they drove past the Ewells house and parked their car a few blocks away. They grabbed the backpack and the gun, got out of the car, closed the door, and moved quickly through the darkness to the Ewells house. Once the killer got there, they walked around to the backyard that was surrounded by a low cinder block fence. They dropped their bag and the gun into the backyard and then climbed over the fence, they grabbed their things, and then ran to a small shed in the backyard and stepped inside. The killer had studied everything about the house, and they knew there was a spare key on the floor of the shed. So they pulled a flashlight out of their bag, they found the key, they grabbed it, and then darted across the yard towards the back door. The killer unlocked the door and walked inside. The house was dark, but the killer found their way to Dale and Glee's bedroom. They turned on the light, opened their backpack, and pulled out a large plastic sheet and unrolled the sheet across the floor. Then the killer put their gun down on the plastic sheet, they walked across the room to a jewelry box, they emptied it and put the stolen jewelry in their backpack. The killer then sat down on the plastic sheet, they reached into their backpack again and pulled out ammunition as well as a homemade silencer made with PVC pipe and several tennis balls that had been cut in half. The killer loaded their gun and attached the homemade silencer to it. Then they sat there on the plastic sheet and waited patiently for someone to come home. Several hours later, at about 5 p.m., the killer heard the garage door open. The killer felt butterflies in their stomach and a jolt of nervous energy. They grabbed their gun, they ran down the hall, and crouched down in a room that was across from the kitchen. The killer could hear a door open and then also Glee and Tiffany talking. The killer tried to control their breath and told themselves to stay calm and just wait for the right moment. Then, Tiffany walked past the killer in the hall and went into the kitchen. The killer immediately sprung up from their hiding spot, walked down the hall after her, and then pointed the gun into the kitchen and fired. The bullet hit Tiffany in the back of the head. Tiffany's drink flew from her hand, blood splashed onto the walls and floor, and she fell face down. Tiffany had died almost instantly. The killer heard Glee say something from another room, so they spun around in the hall. Then Glee came around the corner and saw the killer. Glee screamed, she turned, and started to run away, but the killer fired off 3 shots in her direction, and Glee stumbled into the office nearby. The killer ran down the hall to the office and saw Glee lying on her side and bleeding, but she was still breathing, so the killer aimed and shot Glee just below the eye. The killer was breathing fast now. They walked away from Glee's body and went to hide in the room near the kitchen, where they tried to calm down and got ready to wait some more. About 30 minutes later, the killer heard the garage door open again. The sound of the door had made them tense up, and so they stood and raised their gun and got ready for the next killing. The killer heard Dale walk into the house, and then when Dale walked down that hallway right past the killer stepped out of their hiding place, raised their gun, and shot Dale in the back of the neck. Dale immediately crumpled to the floor, and newspapers he'd picked up from the front yard scattered all around him. Dale died in the hallway before ever seeing the bodies of his wife and daughter. The killer walked forward, kneeled down, and got a close look at Dale to make sure he really was dead. Satisfied, the killer grabbed Dale's wallet out of his pants pocket, slipped Dale's cash and credit cards into their own pockets, and then dropped the wallet back on the floor. Then the killer rushed through the house, emptying drawers and cabinets, knocking stuff off of tables, and trying to make the scene look like a random burglary as much as possible. Then the killer ran to the main bedroom, rolled up their plastic sheet, and put it in their backpack. Then they walked out of the house through the backyard, put the key back where they had found it in the shed, and climbed over the fence away from the property. The killer did their best to move fast through the neighborhood without drawing any attention to themselves. They made it back to their car, they hopped in, and they sped away. A few minutes later, they pulled onto the highway and left Fresno behind. When they finally made it home, they sat down in their bed and waited for the phone to ring, because they knew Dana Ewell would be in touch soon. Joel Radovich, the young man Sousa had never trusted, murdered Dale, Glee, and Tiffany. But Joel had carried these murders out at Dana Ewell's request. It would turn out that despite what Joel had told Sousa, he and Dana were close friends. In fact, some people said they were almost inseparable. And according to some of their classmates, Dana and Joel seemed to lack any sense of morality. They had convinced themselves there was no difference between right and wrong, and so any action, even murder, could be justified. And Dana wanted to murder his parents and his sister because with all of them gone, he would inherit $8 million and his father's company. Dana didn't just want to follow in his father's footsteps, he wanted to replace his father. In fact, in the story Dana's college newspaper had written about him, Dana claimed to be the brains behind his father's successful airplane business, and he even implied he was running the company while going to college. So Dana had offered Joel $4 million of the inheritance he was sure to get if Joel would kill his family. Dana had given Joel a layout of the house and said he would leave a key in the shed for him and told him how to disable the alarm system. Joel had accepted the deal. Then he bought a book called Hitman, a technical manual for independent contractors, to help him plan the perfect murders. The book had led Joel to shave off all of his body hair so he wouldn't leave any hair behind at the crime scene, which could then be used as DNA evidence. And the book suggested using a gun and a homemade silencer that could not be traced back to the shooter. But Joel needed help with that part of the plan, so he had turned to his good friend, the TGI Fridays bartender, who was an avid gun collector. The bartender had given Joel a semi-automatic 9mm, and he had helped Joel build the silencer. The tennis balls used in the silencer had left these strange yellow fibers on all the bodies. Then, after the murders, the bartender got the gun back, broke it apart, and buried the pieces in different places. And while that was all happening, Dana Ewell had called his father's office, and he had talked to his girlfriend's FBI agent father, all to throw off suspicion and to make people believe he, the son, was truly worried about his family and wanted justice for them. And Dana's tactics had worked for a little while, because it turned out that Sousa was almost positive Joel Radovich had murdered the Ewells not long after they had met in the motel. But it took some serious digging before the investigators became convinced that Dana Ewell was the person behind his family's murder. And putting all the pieces together and getting an airtight case against Dana took a long time. But finally, surveillance on Joel had led police to the TGI Fridays bartender, and after they cornered him at work, the bartender told police he knew everything about the murders and he admitted his part in them. Then he led police to the place where he had buried the barrel of the gun that was used in the murders, and he agreed to testify against Joel and Dana in court. The bartender was ultimately granted immunity for his testimony, and as of 2023, he works as an attorney in California. As for Joel and Dana, they were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Dale, Glee, and Tiffany are all buried next to each other in Fresno. The epitaph on all three of their headstones reads, "Together Forever." Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called Mr. Ballen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are not available on this podcast. They are only on YouTube. Again, that channel is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. It was a freezing cold morning in mid-January 2004 when a repair crew for the local electric and gas company in Princeton, New Jersey, decided to take a break and go get some hot breakfast. The two men had been out all night fixing power poles and lines that had come down in a recent snowstorm. On their way to the diner, they noticed a dark green SUV, engine still running, sitting with its front wheels submerged in 6 inches of water in a creek that ran alongside the road. Thinking the car had been parked there by a local hunter, they didn't think anything of it until their return trip an hour later. Seeing that the car was still there with its wheels still submerged and the engine still running, the men decided to stop and go down and make sure this was not a car accident. A few minutes later, after peering inside the driver's side window of the SUV, both men stumbled backwards in horror. They knew right away that this was no hunter, and they also knew whatever happened here had to be much worse than just a car accident. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak in to the Amazon Music follow button's house and file down the edges on all of their nail clippers. Okay, let's get into today's story. "20-year-old Michelle Rivera looked around the lobby of the glittering Las Palmas Hotel in Manila, the capital city of the Philippines. It was 10 p.m. on the evening of Monday, June 4th, 1990, and the beautiful young woman with long black hair was about to have her first ever face-to-face meeting with her future husband, who had just arrived from America. Looking up at her father, who was standing next to her, Michelle squeezed her dad's arm even tighter as she tried to control her excitement and also her nerves. If everything went well, and Michelle prayed that it would, then very soon she might be spending her honeymoon in one of the fancy suites somewhere inside this glamorous and expensive 23-story hotel. But all that depended on what happened over the next few hours. Michelle knew that her father, a carpenter from their tiny village located far away from this grand hotel, had serious doubts about how his daughter had met up with the man they were about to meet here in this lobby. But Michelle was sure that once her whole family got to know Jonathan Nice, it wouldn't matter that she and the successful scientist from North Carolina had met through what was basically a mail-order bride catalog. As Michelle had kept telling both her parents in the 11 months since Jonathan had first seen Michelle's picture and answered her ad in the Lonely Hearts section of the Manila Times newspaper, the practical reasons they had for placing and responding to that ad had soon been replaced by genuine feelings of love and compatibility. And after almost 1 year of exchanging letters, cards, and gifts through the mail, the marriage proposal that Michelle had received from Jonathan just 4 months into their correspondence now seemed like the answer to both their prayers. For 34-year-old Jonathan, the long-distance courtship had offered the once-divorced and socially awkward scientist the chance to find a wife without really leaving his lab or taking valuable time away from his current research. That research focused on finding a revolutionary cure for asthma, a lung disease that causes episodes of wheezing and breathlessness. And when Jonathan's Filipino coworker had shown Jonathan Michelle's picture in the Manila Times, right away, Jonathan was struck by her youth and beauty. And as soon as Michelle answered Jonathan's first few letters, Jonathan was sure he had found the person he was looking for. A gorgeous partner who was willing to give him a family, be a stay-at-home mom, and focus her attention exclusively on caring for him and their kids. For Michelle, the educational, financial, and cultural roadblocks she had faced ever since graduating from high school had eventually convinced her that marrying a successful American might be her best bet for moving up in the world. So far, her attempts to make that happen on her own had failed. At the age of 16, armed with an outstanding academic record, Michelle had left the Rivera family's bamboo house perched on stilts over the water to attend the National College of Business Administration in the bustling and exciting city of Quezon, 6 hours to the south. But less than 1 year later, Michelle's father could no longer afford the tuition. And so, at the age of 17, Michelle set aside her dream of a professional career and found employment in a city closer to her hometown. Living with her aunt, Michelle would spend the next few years working at a dress shop near the U.S. Naval Base in Subic Bay. The American servicemen and women and their families who lived on and near the base seemed rich compared to the average Filipino. And it wasn't long before Michelle had joined hundreds of other young Filipino women in dreaming of finding an American husband who might take her to the United States. And one way to make that connection was to sign on with Manila's pen pal agencies that promised to find Michelle new male friends in America. And by the time Michelle and Jonathan had begun their correspondence, Michelle, who had very little experience in the world, was captivated by the life she imagined she would have with Jonathan. Her one concern, the fact that he was 12 years older than she was, had evaporated when Jonathan had sent her a picture of himself that showed a tall, fit, and handsome man with thick blonde hair, blue eyes, and a warm smile. He looked every part the former athlete who had played basketball back in college, and who had taken very good care of himself ever since. Michelle had spent the past year looking at that photograph, and she had no doubt that in addition to the emotional connection she and Jonathan had made in exchanging heartfelt letters with each other, as soon as they actually laid eyes on each other, they would feel an instant physical attraction too. Now, Michelle could feel her heart beat faster every time the elevator stopped in the lobby. But when the man Michelle had been waiting for finally did step out of that elevator, Michelle did not recognize him, at least not right away. It wasn't until Jonathan Nice caught sight of Michelle and her father and walked quickly over to where they were standing that Michelle realized with a shock that the flushed, overweight, and balding middle-aged man standing right in front of her must be her future husband. 14 years later, on a snowy day in mid-January 2004, Michelle Rivera Nice was standing alone in the state-of-the-art gym that her husband Jonathan had built for her inside of their $1 million home in the pricey rural community of Titusville, New Jersey. Looking out one of the windows at the beautifully landscaped lawn, Michelle thought about the real cost of hiring Ostrich Nursery just over 3 years ago to plant the snow-covered trees that were now large enough to shade the 3-acre property. Michelle could still remember the first time she met the head of the Ostrich Nursery landscaping crew, Miguel de Jesus, the stocky and strong 34-year-old Puerto Rican who went by the nickname Enyo. He had knocked on the door of the Nice's 21-room, 3-story colonial-style house to give Michelle a summary and bill for the work that his crew had done so far. Michelle could also remember the instant attraction that she and Enyo felt for one another. But it would be another 9 months before Michelle and Enyo actually began the physical affair that had cost so much more than the $50,000 Jonathan had given his wife to get those trees planted. Michelle had not planned or expected to cheat on her husband Jonathan. In fact, until the last few years leading up to her meeting with Enyo, Michelle had thought overall her marriage had been pretty solid. Once Michelle had gotten over the shock she had felt when she first saw Jonathan in the lobby of the Las Palmas Hotel, she had still decided to go forward with their marriage. The real Jonathan may have looked older and less attractive than the picture he had sent her, but in the 7 days they had spent together after he arrived in the Philippines, Michelle believed that their feelings for one another were still the same. And after getting to know Jonathan and seeing how much he obviously adored their beautiful 20-year-old daughter, Michelle's parents had given the couple their blessing. And on Monday, June 11th, 1990, about 1 year after Jonathan had answered Michelle's Lonely Hearts ad in the Manila Times newspaper, Jonathan and Michelle, looking radiant in a beautiful white gown Jonathan had bought for her, were married at a civil service in Michelle's hometown of Orion. After that, in the 7 months that it took Michelle to get the visa that would allow her to join Jonathan in the United States, Jonathan not only set up a generous bank account for Michelle, he also took a second job so he could send regular checks to Michelle's entire family. Jonathan had also come up with a cover story that he and Michelle would tell his family and colleagues when Michelle did appear by Jonathan's side at East Carolina University in the town of Greenville, where Jonathan was a professor. To avoid the embarrassment of Michelle being seen as a mail-order bride, the couple would explain that they had met and married in Hawaii while Jonathan had been away at a conference. And a little over 9 months to the day from Michelle's arrival stateside in April of 1991, the marriage between Michelle and Jonathan delivered on the promise they'd made each other to have a family together. In January 1992, the couple welcomed their first child, and 22 months after that, they welcomed their second son. And 6 years after that, they welcomed their third and final child, a daughter named Samantha. By then, local gossip over Michelle's youth and sudden appearance had died down, and she had been warmly accepted by Jonathan's friends and family. Jonathan had also delivered on the promise he'd made to Michelle that marriage to him would mean a life of financial comfort and stability, not only for Michelle, but for her family back in the Philippines. And by the end of 1998, a little over 9 years since their marriage, all of Jonathan's hard work and long hours at the lab catapulted the couple from the ranks of the financially comfortable into the ranks of the truly wealthy. That's when Jonathan's research into a cure for asthma grabbed the attention of the $4 billion asthma drug market, and Jonathan launched his own multi-million-dollar company called Epigenesis. 2 years later, by early 2000, the family had moved from their apartment in Greenville, North Carolina, to their huge house here at No. 1 Keithwood Court. But for Michelle, there had been a dark side to her husband's success. With each passing year of their marriage, Michelle had really begun to notice that Jonathan was becoming a more and more possessive and controlling partner. He had gone from being proud of being seen in public with his attractive young wife to feeling jealous when any other man so much as looked at her. After Michelle had joined a local gym and become interested in a career as a personal trainer, Jonathan had responded by building a gym inside their home, so Michelle, dressed in form-fitting clothes, would no longer have any reason to leave the house if she wanted to work out. And when Michelle went back to the Philippines to visit her family for the first time in 9 years, Jonathan had refused to let her take their children with her to see their grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. The landscaping project had been another one of Jonathan's efforts to control Michelle's growing restlessness, and also the loneliness and isolation she was feeling, because Jonathan was now spending so many long days working at Epigenesis. Jonathan had given her that $50,000 and told her to do whatever she wanted to make the property outside their house as beautiful as all the new furnishings had made the inside of their house. By the time Michelle picked up the phone and called Ostrich Landscaping, Michelle had also begun to suspect that despite their lavish lifestyle, Jonathan's company, Epigenesis, might not be doing as well as Jonathan kept saying it was. Despite his constant work and travel, investors were starting to lose confidence not only in the drug that Jonathan was developing, but also in Jonathan's performance as CEO of Epigenesis. Not to mention the fact that Jonathan had started drinking heavily. But even though these stresses and strains on their marriage had caused friction between Michelle and Jonathan, it wasn't until Michelle discovered what she thought of as a huge betrayal of trust that the nicest marriage really started to fall apart. That betrayal of trust was a lie that Jonathan had told her right at the beginning of their relationship. Because back in 1989, not only did Jonathan send Michelle a picture of himself that had been taken when he was much younger, he had also lied to Michelle when he told her he was just 34 years old. In fact, when Jonathan answered Michelle's ad in the Manila Times, he was not just 14 years older than his 20-year-old bride-to-be, he was actually 40, making him twice as old as Michelle, whose biggest concern about their relationship had been their age difference. And when Jonathan had filed all the paperwork required to make their marriage legal in both the United States as well as in the Philippines, Jonathan had also falsified his age. Having seen that doctored paperwork, it never occurred to Michelle to question Jonathan's age until more than a decade later when she and Jonathan's mother were talking about an upcoming birthday. When Michelle commented on Jonathan's age, her mother-in-law looked surprised and then dropped the bombshell that would turn what remained of Michelle's love for her husband into anger and resentment. In May of 2002, Jonathan would not be turning 44, he would be turning 52. To Jonathan, that lie he had told so many years ago might have seemed unimportant once he and Michelle had fallen in love and gotten married, but to Michelle, finding out about it 12 years later felt like a perfectly timed blow that would break open all the cracks in their marriage. When Michelle, aged 32, first met the handsome gardener, Enyo, the two of them talked together over coffee. After that landscaping project was finished, Michelle and Enyo, who had a common-law wife and 3 kids, exchanged phone numbers and talked by phone. But it wasn't until a few months after Michelle had found out that her husband had lied to her about how old he was, that Michelle made the step from having an emotional affair with a man whose life was even more complicated than her own to having a sexual affair. Now, 2 years after Michelle's first meeting with Enyo in a seedy pay-by-the-hour motel room the next town over from Titusville, the Nice's stable and prosperous marriage and life was going down the drain. 1 year after the affair started, Jonathan, who had been suspicious about Michelle's sudden and frequent absences from the house, had checked her cell phone and discovered that his young wife was cheating on him. Enyo's wife had discovered the same thing and had kicked Enyo out of the house. After that, Jonathan went to the police claiming that he'd gotten a call from Ennio demanding $500,000 or Ennio would go public with a recording he had made of having sex with Michelle. Even though police couldn't prove Jonathan's claim, the investigation had turned the couple's lives upside down. There had been a confrontation between Ennio and Jonathan, who had taken out a year-long restraining order against Ennio that forbid Ennio from coming anywhere near Michelle or the nice home. There had been angry calls from Ennio's wife, and Ennio himself had begun asking Michelle for money. And then everything else had fallen apart too. Jonathan's new cure for asthma turned out to be a failure, and 10 months ago, in March 2003, the board of directors at Epigenesis had fired Jonathan and kicked him out of the company he had founded 9 years earlier. The board had given him a generous stipend, but it wasn't enough money to support the family's expensive lifestyle. And 4 months later, Michelle overrode her husband's objections and got a part-time job working 25 hours a week behind a cosmetics counter at the local mall. Jonathan himself was now spending almost all day at home, enjoying time with his 3 kids, and also watching Michelle, who was now actively talking about wanting a divorce, even as Jonathan was begging her to stay with him and work on their marriage. Now, letting out a deep sigh, Michelle took one last look through the window before turning away and leaving her workout room. The snow that had fallen the night before had been enough for area schools to close for the day, but Michelle knew that the mall was still open despite the weather. Glancing at her watch, Michelle saw that it was close to 4 p.m., time for her to shower, change into her black uniform, pin her brass Chanel name tag to her breast pocket, and head to her evening shift behind the Chanel counter at Macy's department store. A few minutes after 4, Michelle heard the sound of Jonathan's car in the driveway. He had taken the 3 kids out sledding, and now they were home just for a few minutes before heading off to Samantha's gymnastics class, just long enough for Michelle to say hello and goodbye to all 4 of them, and for Michelle to remind Jonathan that after work, she'd be meeting up with a girlfriend at the mall, and then Jonathan and the kids all piled back into Jonathan's brand new big red Hummer and drove away. But even though snow seemed to be the only thing that set that Thursday afternoon apart from the dozens of other Thursdays that had come before, January 15th, 2004 was anything but usual for Michelle Nice. Because by the time Michelle walked out of the house that she and Jonathan could no longer afford and climbed into the Toyota Land Cruiser that they could also no longer afford, the mail-order bride from the tiny village in the Philippines had finally arrived at a decision about her marriage and her future. Putting the big green SUV in gear, Michelle headed out in the gathering darkness towards Quaker Bridge Mall, where she would clock into work at exactly 6:03 p.m. Along the way, Michelle kept checking her rearview mirror. It wasn't just the fights with Jonathan that had been keeping her on edge lately. As Michelle had recently told her close girlfriend, as well as her husband, Michelle had begun to suspect that when she did leave the house, there was someone out there who had begun keeping an eye on her. It wasn't until the maintenance crew from the local gas and electric company saw the dark green Toyota for the second time, still sitting with its front wheels partly submerged in Jacobs Creek, its engine still running, that they decided to stop. It was around 7 a.m. on Friday, January 16th, and the 2 men had spent the entire night working on electric poles and wires that had come down in the recent snowstorm. They'd first spotted the Land Cruiser an hour earlier on their way to get breakfast. Even though the SUV was parked 15 feet below the roadway, it was still easy to see, and with its engine on and front wheels standing at about 6 inches of water, the men had assumed that the vehicle must belong to a local hunter or someone who was out fishing. Now, breakfast finished and heading back to work, the men weren't so sure. And a few minutes later, after scrambling down the snowy embankment from their service truck to take a closer look at the Toyota, their curiosity and concern turned to horror. It wasn't just the frozen blood smeared on the outside of the vehicle and staining the snow next to the driver's side door. It was what the men saw when they looked through the driver's side car window that caused them to stumble backward and grab for their phones. Within minutes of the 911 call to the Hopewell Township Police Department, Jacobs Creek Road was swarming with emergency vehicles responding to the frantic report of a dead body found inside of the dark green Toyota Land Cruiser near an abandoned campsite down at the edge of Jacobs Creek. By the time Detective Daniel McEwen had arrived on the scene an hour later, the area was roped off with red accident tape, and medics had confirmed that the person inside the vehicle was in fact dead. Meanwhile, after finding out the license plate numbers, police also discovered that the car was registered to Jonathan and Michelle Nice, a wealthy couple who lived at No. 1 Keithwood Court, half a mile away. But as Detective McEwen climbed out of his parked car and slid down the slope to the accident scene, he had already recognized the dark green Toyota Land Cruiser. And when he looked inside the open driver's side door, the 40-year-old investigator could also instantly confirm the identity of the woman whose battered, bloody, and frozen body lay slumped over the center console. Because it was Detective McEwen who had handled the investigation 6 months earlier into Jonathan's claim that Michelle's lover, the gardener Ennio, had tried to extort $500,000 from the wealthy founder of the drug company Epigenesis. Now, as the detective looked at the mangled body of Michelle Rivera Nice, his first thought, hasn't this family been through enough, was immediately followed by the realization that what he was looking at was not the result of a tragic car accident. Despite the red accident tape that was strung up around the vehicle, when the detective stepped back and looked around, he took in 3 key details that all pointed to a much darker and more disturbing cause of death. First, there was a set of footprints made by someone wearing large work boots that led away from the passenger side of the car and back up the embankment to Jacobs Creek Road. There was no sign of damage to the vehicle that would have been consistent with the driver losing control of the car and plunging down the 15-foot embankment or colliding with another vehicle. And then there was the position and condition of Michelle's body. The driver's seat where she sat, all 5 foot 2 inches of her, was pushed so far back from the steering wheel and floor pedals that it would have been impossible for her feet to reach the brake or accelerator. As for her injuries, it looked like Michelle's wounds were the result of blunt force trauma, not the result of a car crash. If Detective McEwen was right, it was possible that Michelle had actually been attacked somewhere else and then driven by her murderer here to this secondary crime scene where the murderer tried to make it appear that Michelle had been killed in a car accident. Even before investigators from the New Jersey State Police Major Crimes Unit arrived on the scene at 10:30 p.m. that Friday night to coordinate the investigation, Detective McEwen's past experience with the Nice family had made him the obvious choice for lead detective on this case within the local Hopewell Township Police Department. Operating now on the possibility that what they were looking at was a homicide and not an accident, the Hopewell Township Police had already switched gears into investigation mode. As soon as officers had informed Jonathan Nice that his wife had been in a car accident, they would have enough information from her husband about Michelle and where she had been the night before that they could start interviewing Michelle's friends and acquaintances, as well as her co-workers at the Quaker Bridge Mall, including the woman that Michelle had said she had plans to meet up with after her shift at the Macy's Chanel counter. But for Detective McEwen, who knew that the first 48 hours of a murder investigation were critical because that was when the most people were assigned to the case and also when there was the most publicity that might generate leads, his plan was to focus on the people who he already knew had intense and troubled connections with Michelle Nice. And at the top of that list was her husband, Jonathan. Although Detective McEwen had never been able to prove Jonathan's claim that he was the victim of an extortion scheme, Detective McEwen had learned a lot about the Nice family when he dug into that allegation 6 months earlier, back in July of 2003. At that time, Michelle had admitted to the detective that her husband was right when he'd accused her of having an affair with Miguel Ennio de Jesus, one of the crew leaders from the Ostrich Nursery. And the detective had seen firsthand the turmoil that affair had caused, the confrontation between Jonathan and Ennio, the fight over the restraining order against Ennio, the angry phone calls that Ennio's wife had made to Michelle. Michelle had also told the detective and Jonathan that she had ended the affair after Ennio had started asking Michelle for, quote, loans, end quote, and showing as much interest in her finances as he was showing in her. So, while crime scene techs continued to photograph and collect evidence at Jacobs Creek, and local officers fanned out to interview the nicest neighbors, Detective McEwen and his partner hopped into their unmarked police car and headed out to No. 1 Keithwood Court to get a formal statement from Michelle's husband. And by 11:15 a.m., Jonathan, distraught and haggard, was ushered into the Hopewell police station and seated behind the desk that was right across from the desk where Detective McEwen and his partner sat. Jonathan had been told about Michelle's death before the investigators arrived. Dazed and confused, he had agreed to have a police officer stay at his home with his 3 kids so he could leave immediately with investigators. According to Jonathan, the last time he had seen Michelle was at 4 p.m. on Thursday afternoon when he had brought their 3 kids home from sledding for a few minutes before heading right back out to gymnastics. When they'd left the house, Michelle was getting ready for work, and she had told Jonathan that after her shift ended at 8 p.m., she was going to meet up with a girlfriend. After the kids ate dinner, Jonathan made a call to Michelle that went straight through to voicemail, and he and the children all left a message saying goodnight, and then all 4 of them, Jonathan and his 3 kids, watched a movie together and fell asleep in Jonathan's bed. Jonathan told police it was about midnight when he woke up again and realized that Michelle was still not home. When he dialed her number, his call went straight to voicemail again. With a meaningful look at Detective McEwen, Jonathan explained that despite Michelle's earlier claim that she had ended her affair with Enyo, Jonathan suspected she was still cheating on him. So even though it was unusual for Michelle to stay out this late, Jonathan wasn't surprised. He assumed she must be with one of her lovers, which would also explain why she still was not home that morning. So instead of trying to find Michelle, Jonathan only stayed up long enough to take an anti-anxiety medication prescribed by his doctor, hoping just to calm himself down. Not only could the 3 nice children, aged 12, 10, and 5, confirm that their dad was at the house with them last night, and that they all slept together in Jonathan's bed, Jonathan also told the detectives that if Michelle had died under suspicious circumstances, the person they should be talking with was Enyo. And here, the research scientist reminded Detective McEwen about Enyo's extortion demand the previous summer for $500,000. Before getting a ride home from the police station, Jonathan also told police that lately, Michelle had begun complaining that she was being followed when she was out in town, maybe by Enyo or one of the gardener's friends, his wife, or maybe another family member. Rubbing at his shadowed eyes, Jonathan said that he wished now that he had taken her concern more seriously. And by midday Saturday, Detective McEwen and every other officer assigned to the Michelle Nice investigation were also feeling a new sense of urgency, because the medical examiner's report, issued at 4 p.m. on the 17th, had confirmed that Michelle Nice had been murdered, and that the cause of death had been a savage beating. 2 hours after that report was issued, the other prime suspect on Detective McEwen's list, Miguel Enyo de Jesus, accompanied by his attorney, walked into the Hopewell Township Police Department. During the extortion investigation the previous summer, Detective McEwen hadn't just found out a lot about Michelle and Jonathan Nice, he'd also found out a lot about Enyo. Like the fact that the gardener used several different names and social security numbers in an effort to avoid paying court-ordered child support to a family from an earlier relationship. The detective had used those various aliases to finally track Enyo down at an apartment he was sharing in Cranberry, New Jersey with his common-law wife, Patricia, 40 minutes east of where the Nice family lived. But it wasn't until Enyo had lawyered up that he was willing to speak with investigators. And with that lawyer sitting next to him, Enyo made a series of admissions that would put him squarely in police crosshairs. According to Enyo, he and Michelle had resumed their affair just 2 months after Michelle had told her husband that the affair was over, and while Enyo was still subject to the restraining order to keep away from the Nice family. Enyo also admitted that he had met up with Michelle on Thursday night before she was killed, when the couple had rented a cheap motel room for 2 hours. But Enyo, like Jonathan Nice, also had an alibi. According to the gardener, after they had checked out of Mount Motel, Enyo had driven Michelle back to the Quaker Bridge Mall and kissed her goodnight at 12:30 a.m., just as Thursday night clicked over into Friday morning. Then, in an effort to hide where he'd been from his wife Patricia, Enyo said he met up with a friend at a bar 40 minutes from Michelle's home before heading to his own house at 1:15 a.m., where his wife was awake and waiting for him. But even as officers prepared to test every minute of Enyo's alibi, the investigation into Michelle's death was about to go in a whole new direction, because Detective McEwen had found himself circling back to a comment that Michelle's husband had made almost 2 days earlier. The detective did not know it at the time, but that comment would end up being the key to solving Michelle's brutal murder. And by Sunday, January 18th, just 72 hours after Hopewell Township Police had received the 911 call reporting the discovery of her body down at Jacobs Creek, Investigators had identified and were preparing to arrest Michelle's murderer. Based on what police discovered when they followed up on Jonathan's offhand remark to Detective McEwen about Michelle's last day alive, here is a reconstruction of what really happened on the night that Michelle was killed. By the time Michelle had dragged her suitcase out of her house and into the attached garage of No. 1 Keithwood Court, it was after 1 a.m. in the very early morning of Friday, January 16th, and Michelle had said everything she needed to say to her killer. She had made her decision. It was just like she had told her closest friends. She was tired of the arguments, the guilt, and the demands. Still dressed in her black work outfit with the Chanel name tag pinned to her blouse, Michelle slipped off her shoes so she would make as little noise as possible. She could only hope that her children had not heard anything that had happened during the last 30 minutes since she'd arrived home from the Quaker Bridge Mall. Looking at the bulging suitcase, Michelle realized that getting it into the back seat of the Land Cruiser would take time that she didn't have. Better to leave it, so now, moving quickly, she stepped up to the driver's side of the car, opened that door, and climbed in behind the wheel. The garage was dark, except for the interior car light. The garage door was closed, and the overhead lights were not on. But before Michelle had time to close the driver's side door and turn on the car engine, her killer had suddenly stepped forward out of the gloom. And the nightmare that would later be detailed in the medical examiner's autopsy report was about to begin. Reaching in through the open car door, Michelle's killer grabbed her arm. Squeezing hard enough to leave a fingerprint pattern of bruises, the killer dragged the 100-pound woman out of the seat and threw her onto the floor. As Michelle tried to scramble back to her feet, the killer reached behind her and pulled a baseball bat from a nearby utility shelf. As Michelle turned to get away, her killer wound up and swung the bat with all their might, hitting Michelle squarely in the back of her skull. Falling to the floor of the garage, Michelle's head struck the running board of the Land Cruiser, leaving a dark splash of blood that dripped down onto the ground. Even though the medical examiner would later determine that the strike from the baseball bat had fractured Michelle's skull from the top of her eye socket to the base of her neck, at that point, the mother of three still gathered herself for a fight, trying to cover her face with her hands before turning over and dragging herself back to her feet. But Michelle, barefoot now except for her stockings, only made it a few steps towards the door before sliding in her own blood. As she started to go down onto her hands and knees, the killer came up on her from behind, and grabbing her shoulders, the killer immediately began to slam Michelle's face and head into the concrete floor of the garage again and again, only stopping after hearing what they later described as a sickening thud of smashed bone and cartilage. According to the medical examiner, Michelle's attempt to fight off her attacker had left her with cuts and bruises on her hands, wrists, and lips. The beating had not only cracked her skull, it had also caused significant internal organ damage, as well as bruising and injuries on her arms, hips, and elbows. But as Michelle's murderer slowly stood up, breathing hard and looking around the dim interior of the garage, the medical examiner would later estimate that it may have taken as much as 10 minutes before Michelle finally choked to death on her own blood. In that time, the killer thought through the next steps. Leaning down again to check for a pulse that was no longer there, a jolt of adrenaline surged through the killer. Gathering up Michelle's small body, the killer pushed her into the driver's seat of the Land Cruiser. Then the killer grabbed Michelle's blood-spattered suitcase, shoving it onto the back seat of the Toyota. Oblivious to the biting cold, at 2:15 a.m. on Friday morning, the killer circled the big green SUV and climbed into the passenger seat. Reaching over and starting up the engine, the killer gripped the steering wheel with one hand and used the other to click open the garage door. Then, awkwardly, making sure the headlights were turned off and using the long handle of an ice scraper to push the pedals of the accelerator and brake, the killer put the car into reverse and began backing out of the garage. Once the killer had enough room in the driveway to turn the car around, they immediately lost control of the vehicle, veering off the driveway and onto the front garden before finally coming to a stop back on the driveway. With the car now in park, the killer leaned over the center console and pushed the driver's seat back as far as it would go so there was more room to manipulate the floor controls with the handle of this ice scraper. Or, as police believe, for the killer to climb into the driver's seat and drive the car while sitting literally on the lap of Michelle's bloody and lifeless body. A few minutes later, the killer was driving slowly along the narrow, dark stretch of Jacobs Creek Road, looking for the white picket fence that was the one break in the guardrail that separated the road from the embankment leading down to Jacobs Creek. Once the killer saw the white wooden fence, they slowed, then steered the car so it broke and then ran over the fence. A moment later, and the big car had dropped gently down the 15-foot slope, passed through the middle of the small campsite, and broken the surface ice of the creek before the front wheels came to rest in 6 inches of water. 14 years earlier, when Michelle had met her future husband for the first time in person in the lobby of the Las Palmas Hotel, the one feature she had recognized from the photograph he had sent her of a much younger version of himself was his height. Now, after looking at his wife's dead body slumped over in the seat next to him, her right eye swollen shut, and the white bone of her skull showing through the cuts on her forehead, Jonathan Nice opened the passenger side of the family Land Cruiser and unfolded his heavy 6-foot 4-inch frame from the car as he stepped out onto the smooth expanse of unbroken snow. It was 3:15 a.m. Jonathan had been waiting for Michelle when she arrived home 2.5 hours earlier. As soon as her car had pulled into the garage, Jonathan had used the remote to close the garage door before beginning what was by now a familiar and vicious argument about Michelle's ongoing affair with Enyo. This time, though, Michelle didn't just tell her husband that she wanted a divorce, something she'd been saying for almost 5 months. This time, Michelle had walked into their bedroom, pulled out a suitcase, and begun packing to leave. For a long time now, Michelle had suspected that Jonathan had hired someone to follow her or was following her himself. Michelle had also come to believe, after finding a condom inside one of Jonathan's travel bags, that she wasn't the only one in this marriage who was being unfaithful. Now, Jonathan turned so he was facing the embankment, and wearing a pair of shoes he had constructed himself by gluing size 12 work boot soles onto the uppers of a pair of comfortable moccasins, he left the car and trudged through the snow back up to Jacobs Creek Road. From there, dressed in pajama bottoms and a t-shirt, he walked the mile back to the house on Keithwood Court, where he spent the next few hours covering his tracks. He dumped some of his bloody clothes and towels he'd used to clean the garage floor into the washing machine to soak, turning the water in the tub pink. He filled white plastic trash bags with the blood-soaked paper towels he also used to clean the floor and walls before spot painting areas of the garage to cover blood spatter. He stuffed his wet black PJ bottoms behind the couch and then used a saw to cut the soles of his shoes away from the moccasin uppers before cutting the soles into small pieces and hiding them throughout the house. And he left the baseball bat, still stained with Michelle's blood, on the storage shelf where he had grabbed it a few hours earlier. And then, Michelle's husband and killer went upstairs and crawled back into bed with his 3 kids and waited for the call that would tell him that Michelle had been killed in a tragic car accident out on Jacob Creek Road. It would turn out that from the moment Detective McEwen and his partner arrived at number 1 Keithwood Court on the morning that Michelle's body had been discovered and saw the crazy tire tracks in the snow on the Nice driveway, the detective had suspected that Jonathan Nice must be involved in Michelle's murder. Ever since meeting the Nice family back in July of 2003, the detective had been convinced that Jonathan's extortion claim against Enyo, along with Jonathan's claim that Enyo had threatened to hurt Michelle, were completely unfounded. And in conducting interviews back in the summer and again now that Michelle was dead, what he kept hearing from people close to Michelle was that Jonathan's lies about his age and his escalating attempts to control his younger wife, coupled with Michelle's resentment and restlessness, had turned the couple's marriage into a volatile stew of jealousy and, finally, uncontrolled rage. But despite these suspicions, it wasn't until Jonathan contradicted the formal statement he had given police that Detective McEwen had the grounds he needed to get a warrant that would allow police to search the Nice home for physical evidence that would tie Jonathan to his wife's murder. That moment came when Jonathan, riding with the detective back to the Nice home, after Jonathan had sworn to police that the last time he had seen his wife was at 4 p.m. on Thursday afternoon, broke the silence inside the police car and told Detective McEwen somewhat offhandedly that until Jonathan and Michelle had fought later on the night when Michelle got back from work, Jonathan had really believed that the couple could make their marriage work. So, even as local police were out on Saturday tracking down and then interviewing Michelle's lover, Enyo, members of a special 13-member joint task force of state and local law enforcement, armed with a search warrant, were entering No. 1 Keithwood Court, where, over the next 3 days, they would find one incriminating piece of evidence after another. On Sunday, January 18, 2004, 2.5 days after the discovery of Michelle's body, Jonathan was brought into the Hopewell police station for a second interview, during which the 54-year-old scientist confessed to the murder of his 34-year-old wife. Jonathan would go on to say that he acted in self-defense after Michelle, who was 1 foot shorter than her husband and weighed 100 pounds compared to his 240 pounds, had threatened him with either a stiletto knife or the heel of one of her high-heeled shoes. The jury that found Jonathan Nice guilty of passion provocation manslaughter 19 months later did not buy that story, but they did reject the prosecution's claim that Michelle's death was premeditated. In September of 2005, Jonathan Nice was sentenced to 8 years in prison. 5 years later, he was released and returned to his kids, who had been placed in the care of Jonathan's brother and sister-in-law. In 2012, 8 years after Michelle's murder, Jonathan founded a successful new company that sold drugs claiming to cure the symptoms of cancer in dogs. But 8 years later, in one final twist to a story that had caused a national sensation back in 2004, a federal investigation proved that Jonathan's so-called cancer-curing drugs were a fraud, and that Jonathan's company was nothing more than a money-making scheme that had netted more than $1 million. And on Friday, December 23, 2022, 18 years after murdering his wife Michelle, Jonathan Nice was convicted by a federal grand jury of wire fraud and the interstate shipment of misbranded animal drugs. As of June 2023, the 73-year-old scientist now faces a large fine and up to 32 more years in prison. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called Mr. Ballen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, many of which are only available on YouTube. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
Late one night in 2004, a young woman was asleep in her downstairs bedroom when she suddenly was awoken by a bright light shining in through her bedroom window. The motion sensor light outside on the garage had been tripped. The young woman, who was sitting on her bed by this point, squinted and tried to look outside to see what had caused this, but she couldn't see anything, and so she just assumed it had to have been a neighborhood cat or something that had tripped the sensor. So she lay back down and was nearly back to sleep when something else caused her to suddenly sit up wide awake in her bed. But this time, it was not a bright light. It was a sound, footsteps to be exact. And these footsteps were not outside. They were inside her house, right outside of her bedroom door. Seconds later, this woman would live a nightmare. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to pick up the Amazon Music follow button after their work shift is over, but don't show up, and instead just keep sending them periodic text messages that promise you are only 5 minutes away. Okay, let's get into today's story. The weather on Halloween evening in Napa, California was perfect. The sky was clear and the air was cool without being cold. And all along Dorset Street, that year's most popular costumes were on display. It was October 31st, 2004, and the tree-lined neighborhood of small but pricey houses was a parade ground for pastel-colored princesses, black vampires, smiling yellow SpongeBobs, and Power Rangers in 6 different bright colors. Trailing behind and alongside these trick-or-treaters were parents who were shining their flashlights at the skull and bones and headstones planted in front yards and at the strings of orange lights around doorways. The whole scene was a snapshot of what made Napa such a desirable place to live. Located just north of San Francisco, the trendy city of 70,000 residents still had a small-town vibe. Spread out around it were miles of green hillsides, covered with the acres of grapevines that had made the Napa Valley the premier wine-producing region in the United States. And tucked inside of this agricultural wonderland, the city of Napa was both beautiful and safe. And on this particular Halloween night, if there was one house on Dorset Street that radiated that feeling of safety and warmth, it was number 2631. Barely 900 square feet in size, the olive green 1.5-story home with the white trim and the attached 2-car garage looked almost doll-sized. Hardly big enough for the 3 26-year-old women who had all moved in there together over the course of the last 9 months. 2 of those roommates, Leslie Mazzara and Adrienne Insania, had been busy all evening passing out big handfuls of candy. Their excitement about this first Halloween together in this little house could be heard loud and clear as they oohed and awed over the little visitors trooping past the effigy of a witch hanging from the outside porch ceiling to knock on the front door. The 2 roommates who greeted the trick-or-treaters, Leslie and Adrienne, and their third roommate, who was sitting in the living room behind them, could not have been more different. Even before she got her degree in engineering, Adrienne had always loved building things. And in keeping with her hands-on and matter-of-fact approach to life, she had no problem telling people what was on her mind. Leslie was a former beauty queen from the Deep South who moved with the grace of someone who had spent 15 years of her life taking ballet lessons. She also had so much natural charm and magnetism that the first time she had visited one of the most famous vineyards in Napa Valley, she had immediately been offered a job. 6 months later, and Leslie had been promoted twice to her current position as a sales coordinator at the winery named after the famous Hollywood film director Francis Ford Coppola. Even the children who were there to get candy seemed immediately taken with Leslie. From her always expertly applied makeup to her long southern drawl, Leslie had stood out from the crowd from the moment she had arrived in Napa just 6 months earlier. But the children weren't just seeing Leslie's striking green eyes and friendly smile. As one of Leslie's admirers had once said, when looking for words to describe Leslie's deeper beauty, it was like trying to describe a rainbow to someone who couldn't see. In contrast to Adrienne and Leslie's outgoing personalities, the third roommate at 2631 Dorset Street, 26-year-old Lauren Minza, was the quietest and the neatest of the 3 women. As the volleyball coach of the local community college, Lauren had no trouble yelling out encouragement and instruction to her students, but when it came to any sort of social confrontation, Lauren held back and usually just let Adrienne do the talking. Of the 3 women, Lauren and Adrienne had been the first to move into this rented house on Dorset Street. After graduating from California's Polytechnic State University in 2001, Adrienne had returned to her childhood home in Napa Valley and almost immediately got hired in as an assistant engineer at the Napa Sanitation District. It was there at the Sanitation District that Adrienne had met the person who would become her best friend, a contract supervisor named Lily Prudhomme. Through Lily, Adrienne quickly became part of a new circle of friends. A year or so later, at the start of 2004, Adrienne had met Lauren for the first time at a volleyball class they both took at Napa Community College. And in February, when Lauren found the little house on Dorset Street, she had asked Adrienne to move in and share the rent. As for Lauren, her social life had taken off on the day Adrienne had arrived at 2631 Dorset. In typical Adrienne fashion, Lauren's new roommate did not arrive alone. Right behind Adrienne, carrying cartons and furniture, were Lily and her boyfriend Eric and another friend named Ben, all of whom helped Adrienne and Lauren settle into their new home. In the space of that one day, Lauren had been welcomed into Adrienne and Lily's circle. And by the time all the moving boxes were empty, the whole group of them had been laughing and talking over pizza and beer. Leslie, the last roommate to arrive at 2631 Dorset Street, had walked into their lives 4 months after that pizza party. Leslie had actually been living right next door to them for several weeks, and in passing conversations, Lauren had felt an instant connection to Leslie. Lauren liked Leslie's sense of fun, and even more, Leslie's genuine warmth and interest in other people. So when Leslie's roommates made plans to move out, Lauren and Adrian invited Leslie to move in with them. Before long, the upstairs bedroom across from Adrian's was filled with Leslie's clothes, perfume, and makeup. Leslie's arrival had definitely changed the dynamic at 2631, but in a fun way. While Adrian had arrived at the little house with a tight but small circle of close friends, Leslie arrived with an army, not just friends, but acquaintances and more male admirers than she could even count. And those were just the people Leslie knew in Napa. Her phone was filled with contacts from her life in Georgia and South Carolina, including ex-boyfriends who still made regular calls to Leslie, hoping to rekindle an old romance. But despite her busy social life and being involved with at least 2 different men at the same time, inside 2631, Leslie had respected her roommate's expectation of privacy. For the most part, if any of them wanted to spend the night with a boyfriend, they did it quietly and very infrequently, or they spent the night at the man's house. But that October, Leslie had started breaking that unspoken house rule, causing the first and only real conflict among the 3 roommates. 3 nights before Halloween, on October 28th, Leslie and one of her dates had made so much noise in Leslie's bedroom that Adrian and Lauren decided it was time to call a house meeting. Lauren had dreaded what she expected would turn into an awful confrontation, something she totally hated, but with her amazing charm and tact, Leslie had managed to diffuse the situation. Before the women even sat down together, Leslie sent both Lauren and Adrian an email apologizing for putting them in such an awkward situation and costing them most of one night's sleep. The roommates' ability to resolve the situation with some simple rules about having men over, rather than arguing or fighting about it, had felt like a win for all 3 women. And by Halloween day, everything felt right again with the world. The handyman that their landlord hired was outside working on the house, and that afternoon, Lauren spent a few hours out playing soccer and running errands. Meanwhile, Leslie and Adrian, all strain forgotten, were busy in the kitchen together, making Halloween-themed cupcakes and planning the next big holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas. By around 9 p.m. on Halloween night, nearly all the adults and trick-or-treaters along Dorset Street had all gone home, and the front door light at 2631 had been turned off, leaving the witch and the little patch of pumpkins in the front yard in darkness. Inside the small green house, the empty bowls of candy had been put away, and the 3 roommates were all looking forward to a quiet Sunday evening before the start of a new work week. Adrian was the only one of the women who had plans to go out that night. As she got ready to go visit her boyfriend, Christian Lee, who lived only a few blocks away, Lauren and Leslie settled onto the couch to watch one of their favorite TV shows. At 9:30 p.m., Leslie got a call on her phone and headed upstairs, where she would get another 2 calls, this time from the father of one of her ex-boyfriends that she'd left behind in South Carolina. Looking at the 2 calls come in, Leslie sighed and let them go to voicemail. She'd listen to them later, or not at all. Suddenly tired, Leslie called a good night down to Lauren, and a few minutes later, Leslie was in bed. Meanwhile, Adrian's visit with Christian had ended in an argument. Adrian was ready for the 2 of them to make a serious commitment to one another, but Christian was not ready. As Adrian left Christian's a little after 10 p.m. and began heading home, all she could think about was Lily. Here, Adrian was wanting more from her partner, Christian, while 4 months ago, her best friend, Lily, had moved in the opposite direction with her partner, canceling or at least delaying her plans to marry Eric. Letting herself through the door of 2631 about a half hour later, Adrian reminded herself that love was just not easy. And after saying hello to Lauren and her dog Chloe, Adrian made her way up the stairs to her bedroom, directly across the tiny landing from Leslie's bedroom. By 11 p.m., Lauren and Chloe were also tucked in for the night in Lauren's downstairs bedroom. Just a few minutes before, after letting Chloe outside in the backyard one final time, Lauren had done what the last person to bed always did. She'd made sure all the doors were locked, including the garage door and the back sliding door. Then she had turned out all the indoor and outdoor lights, glanced one last time around the cozy house she called home, stepped inside her bedroom, and closed the bedroom door behind her. 2.5 hours later, a little after 1:30 in the morning, Lauren woke up suddenly to a flash of bright light and a bark from Chloe, who was lying on the bed next to her. Outside her window, the motion sensor light attached to the garage had clicked on. Lauren waited, listening, but heard nothing. Turning back over in her bed, Lauren murmured to Chloe that it must have been a neighborhood cat out on the prowl. But just minutes later, Lauren found herself wide awake a second time, and this time it wasn't the outside light. This time she'd been awakened by a sound coming from inside the house. Shushing her growling dog, Lauren listened intently, and she heard quiet footsteps making their way up the stairs towards the second floor where the other two roommates were sleeping. Lauren's first thought was that Leslie must have broken their new house rule and invited a man over to spend the night, and that was him kind of sneaking into the house to be with her. Annoyed, Lauren did her best to quiet Chloe and go back to sleep. But just a few minutes later, at about 2 a.m., in the early morning hours of November 1st, Lauren heard the first scream. Lauren and her dog instantly bolted upright. It was obvious that that scream had not been from lovemaking. And a moment later, Lauren's confusion turned to panic and terror as she heard a second scream coming from upstairs, followed by the sound of a violent struggle in the room directly above her. Furniture being shoved aside, things falling on the floor, the stamping of bare feet and shoes. And then Lauren heard Adrian's voice raised to a shout. "Oh my God, please help! Please help!" Without turning her light on, Lauren stumbled out of her bed. She opened the door of her room and took one step into the dark hallway. For half a minute, Lauren just stood there listening, paralyzed with shock and fear, until suddenly she heard the sound of the glass light fixture at the top of the second floor landing break. And then she heard pounding footsteps as the intruder seemed to fly down the stairs 2 or 3 at a time, coming directly towards her. Jolted into action by a huge rush of adrenaline, Lauren reached down, grabbed Chloe, and turned toward the back door of the house. But no sooner had she stepped through the sliding door onto the patio and out onto the cold, damp grass than Lauren realized her mistake. The backyard was completely surrounded by a 6-foot-high fence, with no way for Lauren to escape. Terrified, Lauren dragged Chloe with her into a thicket of bushes, and just above the thudding of her own heart, Lauren could suddenly hear, from inside the house, the clack of the wooden window blinds in the kitchen. The sound told her one thing. The intruder had not followed her into the backyard. They were somewhere in the front of the house where the kitchen was. And then, when the clacking sound stopped, Lauren thought she heard a window break. Whoever had been inside the house must have left. And then, in the sudden quiet, Lauren heard it again. Adrian's faint but desperate cries for help. A moment later, Lauren crawled out from the cover of the bushes, and then, feeling her way in the darkness, she re-entered the house through the back door, and as carefully and quietly as she could, she picked up the receiver of the kitchen phone to call 911. But all she heard was the beep 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 of a busy signal. And in her mind's eye, Lauren pictured the phone upstairs. The receiver knocked off its hook during that terrible struggle she'd heard just a few minutes earlier. Lauren put the phone down, and then, taking a deep breath and praying she was right, that the intruder was gone, she tiptoed to the front of the house, turned, and then began to climb the stairs. She was careful not to touch the dark smears along the right side of the staircase that she knew were blood, focusing instead on the light that was coming from one of the bedrooms. Reaching the tiny landing, Lauren stepped around the broken glass light fixture on the floor and turned so she was looking through the door into Leslie's room. But before Lauren could even register the feeling of wet blood on the floor under her bare feet, Lauren saw Adrian. Her friend was crouching in a narrow space between the wall and Leslie's bed. But something was terribly wrong. Adrian's face and neck and arms were covered in blood. As Lauren rushed over to help her friend, Adrian made an effort to speak, but all Lauren heard was a long, gurgling breath deep in Adrian's throat. It was at that point that Lauren noticed something else. On top of the bed, in a pile of blankets and clothes, she saw the body of her other roommate. Leslie lay face down and motionless, with deep cuts all across her back and upper arms. Lauren tried not to slip in the blood as she backpedaled out of Adrian's room. Turning on the landing, Lauren ran down the stairs, she grabbed her cell phone out of her bedroom, and she punched in 911. By the time police and medical emergency vehicles had pulled up to the curb outside 2631 Dorset Street at 2:13 a.m., Lauren and her dog Chloe were still sitting inside of Lauren's car. Afraid that whoever had attacked her friends might come back for her, Lauren had grabbed her dog, jumped into her car, cell phone pressed to her ear, and driven up and down the street as she begged the emergency dispatch operator to send help. and did her best to describe what had happened. She said, "Both my roommates are hurt. I think they're dying." The first officers on the scene set up a loose defensive perimeter around the house. Before letting the emergency personnel inside 2631, 4 other officers, guns drawn, cleared the inside of the little house to make sure it really was empty, except for the 2 victims. The police, who had reached Adrian just before she died, later described the carnage in the upstairs bedrooms as the bloodiest crime they'd ever seen. Meanwhile, wrapped in a blanket and standing outside the house, Lauren told an officer trained in questioning victims of trauma all that she could remember about the attack, from the moment the light flicked on in the backyard to the calls she had just made to 911 operators. And as Lauren would repeat over and over again to police and later to the families of Adrian and Leslie, no, at no point had Lauren seen the intruder's face or noticed any details that would help police identify who had attacked her roommates. And no, Lauren had absolutely no idea who would want to hurt either Leslie or Adrian. By 2:30 a.m. on November 1st, the little house on Dorset Street, surrounded by yellow crime scene tape, was lit up in the glow of portable floodlights. Most crime scenes yield maybe 2 to 3 pieces of physical evidence, but over the next 2 days, the crime scene techs, who were now combing the inside and outside of 2631, would collect a whopping 71 pieces of evidence. Meanwhile, as small groups of neighbors began to gather together in the street, whispering to each other and calling out questions to the police, Napa Police Detective Todd Schulman was already giving the orders that would get the investigation going. The 4-year veteran investigator assigned officers to canvass neighbors and the growing crowd outside to see if anyone remembered seeing anything or anyone that night that was out of place or suspicious. And based on what Lauren had been able to tell police about her roommate's work, personal and social lives, the detective also ordered his team to start interviewing friends, coworkers, boyfriends, and acquaintances of the 2 victims. And by mid-morning, 7 hours after Adrian and Leslie were murdered, police would be knocking on the doors of Adrian's best friend, Lily Prudhomme, and Adrian's boyfriend, Christian Lee. Further away, at the vineyard where Leslie worked, her co-workers would also be questioned by police, and as police began gathering information about Leslie's social life, so would a long list of Leslie's current and former boyfriends. But even as police fanned out around Napa and began working the phones to trace Leslie's connections in South Carolina and Georgia, crime scene techs had already collected evidence that would wind up making a big cut in the possible pool of suspects. By Thursday, November 3rd, 4 days after the early morning double murder, the police knew that the killer was a male, a finding that ruled out the female half of the US population. Forensic investigators had been able to collect several critical pieces of physical evidence from the crime scene that would all contain samples of the killer's DNA. There was a packet of plastic zip ties, the kind that could be used to bind a person's wrists, that the killer had dropped just under the front window where they entered and then later exited the house. There was also a smear of blood that did not belong to the victims on the aluminum siding of the house near the window. And finally, police had found 3 cigarette butts in the front and backyard of 2631. DNA from all 3 pieces of evidence was identical, and it showed, without a doubt, that the killer was a man. Unfortunately, what the DNA did not reveal was the identity of this man. The DNA would turn out not to match the DNA sample that police had collected from Adrian's boyfriend, Christian, and when the DNA results were run through a nationwide database of more than 4 million known criminal offenders, there was no match there either. Although the police would not release this information to the public for another 2 weeks, the DNA results did clear any females, including Lauren and Lily, of any involvement in the murders. And even though Detective Schulman could not completely rule out the possibility that the murders of Adrian and Leslie were just the result of a burglary gone horribly wrong, the DNA results showing the killer was a man did support the investigators' emerging theory of the murder. The violence of the attack suggested the killer had a personal motive. And with Adrian's boyfriend off the suspect list, and given the number of men who had been close to or involved with Leslie, police began to focus on Leslie as the killer's prime target, and Adrian must have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a witness who had to be eliminated. Still, there was a second theory about these murders, a theory that would make this case even harder to solve, and one that was already keeping terrified residents of Napa awake at night. That theory was that the murders were the work of a serial killer, a person with no connection to their victims, a killer who might strike again at any moment or leave without a trace and continue to kill somewhere else. Within days of the murders, local security companies saw an uptick in the number of people in Napa County requesting the installation of alarm systems. And by November 9th, the day of Adrian's funeral, the 350 mourners who watched a video showing Adrian's progression through life from childhood to engineer were talking to one another in hushed whispers about a killer who could be lurking in every backyard. One day later, on Wednesday, November 10th, the city of Napa offered a $100,000 reward, money collected from local businesses, for information leading to the arrest and conviction of whoever had killed Adrian and Leslie. But despite the size of that reward, and despite the long list of potential suspects in the murder, most of them connected in some way to Leslie Mazzara, as November 2004 came to a close, police had still not made any arrests. And by December 2nd, 1 month after the Halloween night murders, Napa's police commander was offering a very sobering update on the investigation. So far, progress had consisted of what police figured out had not happened at 2631 Dorset Street. Investigators had ruled out domestic violence. They had also ruled out any gang-related connections to the murder, a lead that popped up when they found out that Leslie's father was serving back-to-back life sentences in Florida for his role in a murder conspiracy. Adrian's boyfriend, Christian, had also been ruled out as a suspect, along with that father of one of Leslie's ex-boyfriends who had called Leslie twice the night before she was killed, and the handyman who had been working on the roommate's house on Halloween day. But according to the commander, the lack of progress had nothing to do with a lack of effort on the part of law enforcement. In the days after the murders, several other high-profile agencies had joined forces with the Napa police. Those included a response team from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Napa County Major Crime Investigations Team, the California Department of Justice, and a handful of recently retired local detectives who had been rehired to help investigate this case. And behind the scenes, police had collected DNA swabs from almost 200 men who had some connection with the victims, and investigators had conducted nearly 1,000 interviews across 8 different states. Still, it just wasn't enough. Standing up in front of a packed press conference, the commander of the Napa Police Department told the public that 1 month after the murder, law enforcement had nothing to indicate that they were going to solve this case, quote, today, tomorrow, or next week, end quote. And if anything, that prediction turned out to be a very big understatement. Because over the next 10 months, the only breakthrough on the case was the use of a new DNA analysis tool that allowed police to further narrow down their suspect pool. In addition to knowing that the murderer was male, police now knew with good certainty that he was also of Northern European descent with possibly blonde hair and blue or green eyes. But while this ruled out suspects of color, it wasn't enough of a break to lead police to their killer. In the meantime, as the investigation dragged on, friends of Adrian and Leslie tried very hard to keep the memory of these two women alive and to move forward with their own lives. In between candlelight vigils, fundraisers, and interviews with the media about Adrian and Leslie, there was only one bright spot. Inviting their friends and Adrian's family to join them, Lily and Eric got married in a celebration of life service at the Big White Episcopal Church on 3rd Street in Napa. It would not be until the fall of 2005, almost a year after Adrian and Leslie were murdered, that investigators finally got the break they needed to solve the so-called Halloween homicides. After basically running out of options for kickstarting an investigation that had ground to a halt, the Napa Police Department had decided to go public with one of the details in the case that they had been keeping a secret. Holding back evidence is a common practice in investigations. Investigators like to use undisclosed information to help confirm whether a suspect actually knows details about the crime that have not been made public. It also helps police rule out false confessions. In this case, the detail related to the cigarette butts that had been picked up by crime scene techs in the front and backyards of 2631 Dorset Street early on the morning of the murders. In August 2005, 9 months after those cigarette butts were collected and tested for DNA, further analysis had revealed that the cigarettes themselves, Camel Turkish Golds, were very unusual. Not only did the cigarettes have distinctive markings around the filter, they had only been on the market for 14 months, and they were only sold in Napa by a handful of stores. A month later, on September 21st, in a last-ditch effort to jog the memory of anyone who might know a smoker of Turkish Gold cigarettes, Detective Schulman released the name and description of the cigarettes to the local media, calling the information an important new piece of evidence in the Halloween murders. And for one television viewer, that evening's headline story about these Camel Turkish Gold cigarettes immediately struck a nerve. Sitting in a house just 2 miles away from the place where Adrian and Leslie had been killed 11 months earlier, the viewer suddenly stiffened up in his chair and turned up the volume on the TV set. As the newscaster ran through the latest details in the murder investigation, the young man watching knew that he had information that could be vital to the police trying to solve this case. Leaning forward, the young man clicked through other news stations on TV to see if he could find out any more information on what police were calling a breakthrough. 5 days later, on September 27th, Detective Schulman got a call from the Napa police station. Someone had just walked into the station asking for a detective and said he had important eyewitness testimony related to the murders of Adrian and Leslie. Based on this person's information, along with follow-up interviews and additional investigation by law enforcement, here is a reconstruction of what police and forensic experts believe happened to Adrian Insania and Leslie Mazzara on the night they were killed. For the killer, Sunday, October 31st, 2004, was a day of terrible disappointment. And at that party, on that Halloween night, as the killer looked around the table at the people sitting there and playing cards with him, his feelings of jealousy, anger, and resentment just kept getting stronger and stronger. Those feelings were helped along by all the alcohol, 1 drink for every hand of cards he lost, and the killer was losing the game badly. By the time the killer had been driven back to his house, he was so drunk he had trouble standing up, and by the time he stumbled into the empty apartment, he couldn't even remember getting dropped off at his own front door. But sometime after midnight, after waking up from a short sleep, the killer was sober enough to make a plan for that night and early morning that did not involve going back to bed. Instead, the killer had decided to go confront at least one of the people that he held responsible for the emotional pain he was feeling. And on his way out to his car, the killer stopped in his garage and put together his murder kit. A packet of plastic ties secured with a rubber band, and a sharp knife with a 4 to 5 inch long blade. Then, just before hopping into his car and heading for his destination, the killer patted his coat pocket, making sure he had a pack of his favorite cigarettes, the only brand he smoked now, Camel Turkish Gold. 10 minutes later, when the killer arrived at the little house at 2631 Dorset Street, he parked the car across the street and turned off the engine. Before getting out, he sat for a while in the darkness, looking at the orange pumpkins on the lawn and the witch with the green face twisting from one of the ceiling rafters of the front porch. Then the killer opened the car door and walked across the street until he was facing the closed white garage door of 2631. Standing there quietly, he pulled out his packet of cigarettes and began to smoke, while he lifted his eyes to stare at the upstairs windows. When he flicked one of his cigarette butts out of his hand and into the grass, the sudden movement was picked up by a motion sensor and the backyard light suddenly turned on, temporarily blinding him. But even though this startled him, and he might have even considered turning around and going back home, he ultimately decided to continue with his plan. He moved from the white garage doors across the front lawn to the front door, where he gently tried turning the knob. But the door was locked. However, that didn't mean the windows were locked too. Taking out his knife, the killer stepped from the door over to one of the front windows. And sure enough, When he inserted the blade between the windowsill and the window sash, he could feel the upward give as he pried the window open. And once he was able to slip his fingers under the sash, it was easy to push the window open all the way, giving him plenty of room to crawl inside. On his way into the house, the killer didn't notice that he had dropped his packet of zip ties secured with a rubber band that had soaked up a sample of his sweat and DNA. Once inside, the killer let his eyes adjust to the darkness, and then he stepped a little to his right, towards the stairs that led to the 2 upper bedrooms. Once upstairs, the killer turned into Leslie's room first. Seeing the sleeping woman on the bed in front of him, he stepped closer and stared down at her. Then, raising his knife high in the air, the murderer brought it down with all his force directly into Leslie's heart. Leslie had time for one short scream before the killer raised the knife and stabbed her again and again. But that scream had been enough to wake up Adrienne in the little bedroom across the hall. Switching on the light, she could see that someone, an intruder, was inside of Leslie's room. A moment later, and Adrienne was out of bed and stepping through the open door across the hallway to help her friend and roommate. The killer looked up, locked eyes with Adrienne, and then he attacked, striking her with the knife. And when Adrienne fought back, the killer struck again and again and again, leaving cuts and wounds all over her upper body, arms, and hands, along with a deep gash across her face and neck. The frenzied attack had left blood everywhere, in pools on the floor and spatter marks along the walls and the bed. But from the very start of their struggle, Adrienne had begun to shout and call out for help, and she did not stop. And even as Adrienne began to bleed out, her cries were so loud that the killer panicked. Running out of the bedroom, he turned on the landing, smashed the glass light fixture on the wall before pounding down the steps, taking them 2 and 3 at a time, leaving streaks of bright red blood where his fingers had touched the wall. Once he reached the bottom of the stairs, the killer raced for the front window, causing the wooden blinds to clatter as he jimmied himself through the opening and back out onto the front porch. This time, the smear of blood he left on the exterior aluminum siding was his own. At some point, he had cut himself, leaving a clear DNA marker alongside the window. A moment later, the killer had reached his car, yanked open the driver's side door, thrown the bloody knife onto the back seat, and headed for the freeway that would take him home. It's believed the killer either didn't know Lauren was still there at the property, or he simply was too panicked from all the screaming and chaos happening upstairs that he did not want to stick around any longer. Either way, Lauren was ultimately spared. Back at his apartment, the killer stripped off his blood-stained clothes and took them out to the backyard. Building a fire in the fire pit, he fed the clothes and his shoes into the bright orange flames. Later that same morning, when Lily Prudhomme heard the news that Leslie and Lily's own best friend Adrienne had been murdered, Lily was absolutely heartbroken. And the one person who was there right from the start to help her cope with this terrible loss was her boyfriend and killer, Eric Koppel. It would turn out that Eric Koppel had been devastated when Lily had called off their wedding back in August of 2004. He knew he had a drinking problem, and he knew he suffered from deep depression, but to Eric, Lily was the most important person in his life, and he could not imagine living without her. Despite canceling their wedding, the two of them were still living together, and on Halloween, the two of them had gone to a party together, where Eric would start playing a drinking card game. But the more Eric drank at that party, the more he kept thinking that October 31st was just hours away from the day, November 1st, 2004, that should have been his wedding day. And instead of getting married to Eric, Lily had planned to spend what would have been their honeymoon on a trip not with him, but with her best friend Adrienne, one of the people, Eric was sure of this, who had probably told Lily that she could do much better than Eric. But it wasn't until Eric had made one final plea that night, asking Lily again to marry him and set a new date for their wedding, that Eric's bitterness overflowed. Lily, angry at how intoxicated Eric was, said no to his marriage proposal, and when she drove him home that night, she didn't stay with him at their apartment. Instead, she went to her parents' house. As Eric Koppel would later tell police when he confessed to the double murder of Adrienne and Leslie, he only remembered bits and pieces of what happened in the early hours of November 1st. He would never say exactly why he had killed the two women. And his own story of how he had committed the murders was different from the reconstruction police had put together based on forensic evidence and the autopsy reports on Leslie and Adrian. According to Eric, he had gone first to Adrian's room to lie down and sleep on a pile of blankets at the foot of her bed. When Adrian woke up, turned on the light, and saw Eric, he attacked her to keep her from crying out. And then, forgetting exactly how or why, Eric told police he had gone into Leslie's room and stabbed her too before running down the stairs and leaving by the front window. And after the murders, Eric had been such a comfort to Lily that 5 months later, the two of them were married in a ceremony that featured a special reading by none other than Adrian's mother, Arlene Allen. Eric made his confession to police on September 27th, 5 days after he had seen on TV the news story in which police linked the killer in the Halloween murders to a white male with light hair and eyes who smoked Camel Turkish Gold cigarettes. It was a brand that was so distinctive that when police had asked Lauren if she or Adrian or Leslie knew anyone who smoked Turkish Golds, Lauren was able to give investigators one name, Eric Koppel. Eric was one of the people who had helped Adrian move into the little house on Dorset Street back in February of 2004, 8 months before Adrian and Leslie were killed. And Eric was one of the only members of Adrian's inner circle who had never been questioned by police or asked for a DNA sample. By the time the news story about the cigarettes had aired, Eric could already feel the net tightening around him. He knew from earlier news coverage that police had recovered the killer's DNA from the scene and that the blood, saliva, tissue, and sweat were his. And as the killer's DNA profile came into clearer focus, a white male of Northern European descent with light hair and light eyes who smoked these Turkish Gold cigarettes, it was a face Eric recognized every time he looked into a mirror. After starting in late summer, before Turkish Gold cigarettes had made the headlines, police, acting on Lauren's tip, had already begun calling Eric. Until then, Eric had slipped below police radar. A quiet and religious 26-year-old land surveyor, he did not appear to have close personal ties with either Adrian or Leslie. And while police collected 218 DNA samples from men known to be among the victim's circle of friends and acquaintances, they did not collect any samples from Eric. When Eric arrived at the police station on September 27th, 11 months after he had killed Adrian and Leslie, he didn't come alone. After seeing the TV news story about the Turkish Gold cigarettes, Eric apparently wrote suicide letters to his family. In response to those letters, his family urged him to go to the police. And so when Eric walked alone into the police interrogation room, the family members who had accompanied him sat waiting for him in the lobby. Despite the differences between the police reconstruction of the crime and the story that Eric told them, Eric Koppel was immediately arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the deaths of Adrian and Sonia and Leslie Mazzara. Police were very skeptical that Eric could be sober enough to plan and carry out 2 murders, stand outside his victim's house smoking cigarettes, and later destroy evidence of his crime, but also be so drunk that he was unable to remember actually stabbing and killing his victims, and unable to recall what he had done with the murder weapon, which was never found. On Tuesday, December 5th, 2006, just 2 months after the second anniversary of the Halloween murders, Eric Koppel pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. That guilty plea meant that the families of his victims would be spared a potentially painful jury trial, and it also meant that Eric would not face a possible death sentence. Instead, Eric was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is currently serving his time at Corcoran Prison, a correction center in California designed specifically to house inmates who have a substance abuse disorder. At Eric's sentencing, Adrian's best friend, Lily, told a packed courtroom there was nothing in the world that Eric could do to make her love him less. 2 years later, though, in 2008, the couple got a divorce. Later, Lily would enroll as a graduate student at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, where she would write a doctoral dissertation on forgiveness. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to pick up the Amazon Music follow button after their work shift is over. But don't show up, and instead just keep sending them periodic text messages that promise you are only 5 minutes away. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the Mr. Ballen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.